In the fog-choked streets of Victorian London, a chilling whisper reaches Sherlock Holmes, a daring plot to steal the Queen's priceless tiara. The star of the empire threatens to shake the monarchy to its core. With time running out, Holmes and Watson plunge into a web of cryptic clues, shadowy conspirators, and royal secrets. From Buckingham Palace's hidden passages to the city's dark underbelly, they race to unmask a mastermind whose ambitions could spark chaos across the empire. Will Holmes' razor-sharp mind foil the heist, or will the star fall into the hands of those who move in silence? Chapter 1. The whisper of a royal heist. The fog clung to Baker Street like a conspirator, muffling the clatter of hooves and the distant cries of newsboys hawking their evening editions. Inside 2-1B, the air was thick with the scent of pipe tobacco and the faint crackle of a fire in the grate. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the room's walls. I, Dr. John Watson, sat opposite, scribbling notes in my journal, attempting to capture the peculiar stillness of the momentous stillness that, with Holmes, was often the prelude to a storm. It was late October, and London was gripped by a chill that seemed to seep into the bones of the city. For days, Holmes had been restless, his mood oscillating between brooding silence and bursts of frenetic energy. No case of significance had crossed our threshold, and I knew well the toll such idleness took on his singular mind. I was about to suggest a walk to clear the fog from both our heads, when a sharp rap at the door broke the quiet dot. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said, holding out a card. "He wouldn't give his name, but he insists it's urgent. Dressed like a lord, but nervous as a cat." Holmes took the card, glanced at it, and raised an eyebrow. "No name, but the cardstock is of the finest quality, and the crest discreet, yet unmistakably royal. Show him up, Mrs. Hudson." I leaned forward, intrigued. "Royal, you say? What could the palace want with us at this hour?" Holmes' lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "That, Watson, is precisely what we shall discover." Moments later, the door opened to admit a man whose appearance confirmed Mrs. Hudson's description. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored overcoat, with a silk scarf draped elegantly about his neck. His face, however, betrayed a nervous agitation, eyes, darting hands, fidgeting with a pair of kid gloves. He glanced at me, then fixed his gaze on Holmes, who had risen to meet him. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" the man asked, his voice low but steady. "I am he," Holmes replied, gesturing to a chair. "And this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. You may speak freely in his presence." The man hesitated, then sat, clutching his gloves as though they were a lifeline. "My name is not important," he began, "but I come on a matter of the gravest consequence. I represent certain interests connected to the crown." Holmes leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "The crown, you say? Yet you come in secrecy, without a name, and with a crest that suggests Buckingham Palace. Pray, continue." The man swallowed, glancing at the door as if expecting it to burst open. "There is a plot," he whispered. "A plot to steal the Queen's tiara, the star of the empire. It is one of the most valuable jewels in the royal collection, not merely for its worth, but for its symbolic power. Its loss would be catastrophic." I felt a jolt of surprise. The star of the empire was no mere bauble. It was a relic of imperial glory, encrusted with diamonds and a central sapphire said to rival the Hope diamond. Its theft would be an affront to the monarchy itself. Holmes, however, remained impassive, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair. "A bold claim," he said, "but claims require evidence. What proof have you of this plot?" The man reached into his coat and produced a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Holmes, who unfolded it with care. I craned my neck to see, but the writing was small and crabbed, barely legible from my vantage point. Holmes' eyes scanned the note, and I saw the faintest flicker of interest cross his face. "This was delivered to my associates this morning," the man said. "It was found slipped under a door in the palace, addressed to no one in particular. The handwriting is unknown, but the intent is clear." Holmes passed the note to me. It read, in a hurried scrawl, "The star will fall before the month's end. The shadows move in silence." No signature, no further clue, just those cryptic words. "Intriguing," Holmes murmured. "The phrasing suggests both urgency and theatricality. A warning, perhaps, but from whom, and to what end?" "It could be a prank," I ventured, though the man's evident distress suggested otherwise. Holmes shook his head. "Unlikely, Watson. The paper is of high quality, the ink expensive. This is no idle jest. But whether it is a genuine warning or a deliberate misdirection remains to be seen." He turned to the visitor. "What measures have been taken?" "None, as yet," the man admitted. "The palace is loath to admit vulnerability. The tiara is kept in a secure vault, guarded day and night. But this note, it has caused alarm. We cannot risk publicity, nor can we ignore the threat. That is why I was sent to you." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the light of a challenge. "Very well, I shall require access to the palace, the vault, and any relevant personnel. Discretion, I presume, is paramount." The man nodded vigorously. "Absolute discretion. You will be granted access tomorrow morning. A carriage will arrive at 9. "Excellent," Holmes said, rising. "Until then, leave the note with me. And sir, I suggest you refrain from discussing this with anyone else. Trust is a luxury we cannot afford until the players in this game are known." The man stood, relief mingling with his anxiety. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. The Crown will not forget your service." As the door closed behind him, I turned to Holmes. "This is no small matter, Holmes. The Queen's tiara. If word of this got out, it would shake the Empire." "Precisely," Watson Holmes said, already pacing the room, "which is why we must tread carefully. The note suggests knowledge of the palace's inner workings, someone close to the Crown, perhaps, or someone clever enough to appear so." He moved to his desk, pulling out a magnifying glass and examining the note with meticulous care. The ink is fresh, the paper uncreased save for its folds. It was written in haste, but with a steady hand. No smudges, no hesitation in the strokes. Our writer is confident, educated, and likely accustomed to secrecy. I watched as Holmes' mind worked, his focus absolute. "What's our next step?" I asked. "Tomorrow we enter the lion's den," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Buckingham Palace is a labyrinth of secrets, Watson. We shall see which ones it yields." The next morning dawned grey and damp, the fog thicker than the day before. At precisely 9, a sleek black carriage drew up outside 2-1B, its driver, a taciturn man who merely nodded when Holmes and I stepped aboard. The journey to Buckingham Palace was swift, the streets partying before the carriage's quiet authority. I felt a prickle of anticipation as we approached the palace gates, there, gilded ironwork looming through the mist. We were met by a stern-faced equerry who introduced himself as Captain Reginald Harrow. He was a man of military bearing, his uniform immaculate, his manner clipped. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, "you are expected. Follow me." The palace's interior was a study in opulence, marble floors, towering ceilings, and portraits of monarchs past, gazing down with imperious eyes. Yet there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that all was not well. Servants moved with hurried steps, their glances darting as if expecting trouble. Harrow led us through a series of corridors, each more ornate than the last, until we reached a heavy oak door flanked by 2 guards. "The vault," Harrow said, producing a key. "The tiara is kept here, along with other treasures of the crown. Only a handful have access." The door swung open to reveal a chamber of cold stone, its walls lined with steel cabinets. At its center stood a pedestal, atop which rested a velvet-lined case. Inside, the star of the empire gleamed a cascade of diamonds, surrounding a sapphire so deep it seemed to hold the night itself. I caught my breath at its beauty, but Holmes' attention was elsewhere, his eyes scanning the room with predatory intensity. "Tell me," he said to Harrow, "who has access to this vault?" Harrow stiffened. "Myself, the Lord Chamberlain, and 2 trusted guards. The key is kept on my person at all times." "And the guards?" Holmes pressed. "They are vetted, loyal men, beyond reproach." Holmes' smile was thin. "No man is beyond reproach, Captain. Not when a prize like this is at stake." He knelt to examine the lock on the vault door, his fingers tracing its contours. A chub lock, complex but not impervious. "Has it been tampered with?" Harrow shook his head. "Inspected daily. No signs of interference." Holmes stood, his gaze sweeping the room. And yet a note was slipped under a door, undetected. Curious, is it not? Harrow's face darkened, but he said nothing. I could see the weight of responsibility pressing on him, the fear of failure in so public a duty. Holmes, however, was already moving, his attention drawn to a faint scuff. Mark on the floor near the pedestal. "Watson, observe," he said, pointing. A mark, fresh, and not from a boot. Something was dragged here lightly, but recently. I squinted at the mark, barely visible against the polished stone. Could it be from cleaning? "Unlikely," Holmes said. "The maids are meticulous, and this mark is precise, as if made by a tool. We shall need to inspect the cleaning schedules and staff." Harrow bristled. "You suspect the staff?" "I suspect everyone," Holmes replied coolly. "Now, Captain, I shall require a list of all who have entered this wing in the past week, as well as the palace's architectural plans. Discreetly, of course." Harrow nodded, though his expression suggested he disliked taking orders from a civilian. "It will be done." As we left the vault, Holmes paused in the corridor, his eyes narrowing as he studied the walls. "Notice anything unusual, Watson?" I looked around, seeing nothing but ornate paneling and flickering gaslights. "Not particularly." "Look closer," he said, pointing to a sconce. "The gas pipe is misaligned, ever so slightly. It has been moved recently." I frowned, trying to follow his reasoning. "Moved? For what purpose?" "That," Holmes said, "is what we must uncover. The palace is a fortress, but even fortresses have their weaknesses." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. Holmes interrogated the palace staff with a precision that bordered on surgical, his questions probing yet disarming. Maids, footmen, even the Lord Chamberlain himself were subjected to his scrutiny, though none seemed to yield the answers he sought. By evening, we were back in Baker Street, surrounded by lists, schedules, and a copy of the palace's plans, which Holmes pored over with relentless focus. "The note is our key," he said, pinning it to his board. "Its writer knows more. Then they reveal. But are they friend or foe? That is the question." I leaned back in my chair, the fire casting long shadows across the room. Could it be a rival faction within the palace? Someone seeking to expose a traitor? "Possible," Holmes said, "but the theatricality suggests a deeper game. The star of the empire is not just a jewel, it is a symbol. Its theft would send ripples far beyond London." As he spoke, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The plot was real, and time was short. Holmes' mind was already racing ahead, piecing together fragments of evidence I could scarcely perceive. I knew, as always, that I was witnessing the beginning of a great unraveling mystery that would test even his formidable intellect. The following days saw Holmes in a frenzy of investigation. He disguised himself as a palace servant to observe the staff unnoticed, slipping through corridors with the ease of a shadow. I accompanied him where I could, my role often reduced to that of recorder and occasional sounding board. Yet even I could sense the net tightening around the conspirators, though their identities remained maddeningly elusive. One evening, as we sat in a hansom cab watching the palace gates, Holmes turned to me, his eyes alight with sudden realization. "What's in the note's phrasing? The shadows move in silence. It is not merely poetic, it is a clue." "How so?" I asked, puzzled. "Shadows," he said, "imply light. Silence implies intent. We have been looking for overt signs of intrusion, but the true danger lies in what is unseen, unnoticed. We must look to the periphery, the servants, the tradesmen, the forgotten corners of the palace." His words sent a shiver through me. The plot was no longer a distant threat. It was close, perhaps closer than we realized. As the cab rolled through the fog, I knew that Holmes was already steps ahead, his mind a beacon cutting through the darkness. By the end of the week, Holmes had gathered enough to form a hypothesis, though he shared little with me. He spent hours studying the palace plans, noting every entrance, every hidden passage. "The tiara is a lure," he said at last. "The true prize is what its theft will provoke: chaos, distrust, perhaps even war." I stared at him, appalled. "War over a jewel." "Not the jewel, Watson," he said. "The idea, the star of the Imperiosio spire, is a symbol of imperial might. Its theft could destabilize alliances, provoke accusations. The conspirators may not be after wealth alone." His words lingered as we returned to Baker Street that night. I could not shake the image of the tiara, its sapphire gleaming like a dark promise. The plot was vast, its implications vaster still. And yet, with Holmes at the helm, I felt a flicker of hope. If anyone could unravel this web of intrigue, it was he. But as I lay in bed that night, the fog pressing against the windows, I could not help but wonder what shadows moved in silence, and how close were they to striking. The days blurred into a relentless pursuit of answers. Holmes' methods were as unorthodox as ever hours spent in disguise. Conversations with informants in the city's underbelly, and endless analysis of the smallest details. I marveled at his stamina, his ability to see connections where others saw only chaos. One morning, as we sat over breakfast, A boy delivered a message to Holmes, a single line, written in the same hurried scrawl as the original note. The shadows grow restless. Holmes' eyes narrowed as he read it, and I knew the game had taken a dangerous turn. "Watson," he said, folding the note, "we are running out of time. The heist is imminent, and we have yet to identify the hand behind it." I felt a surge of determination. "Then we press on," I said. "Whatever it takes." Holmes looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Indeed, Watson, whatever it takes." And so we did, plunging deeper into the labyrinth of the palace, the city, and the minds of those who would dare to steal the Queen's tiara. The whisper of the heist had become a roar, and Sherlock Holmes was ready to meet it head-on. Chapter 2. The Shadow in Buckingham Palace. The early morning fog clung to the cobblestones of Baker Street like a shroud, muffling the clatter of horse hooves and the distant cries of newsboys. Inside 221B, Sherlock Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, his pipe sending lazy curls of smoke toward the ceiling. His sharp eyes, glinting with the intensity of a hawk, were fixed on a crumpled note that lay on the table before him. The cryptic warning about a plot to steal the Queen's tiara had arrived just after dawn, slipped under the door by an unseen hand. Its words were few but deliberate. "The crown's jewel is not safe. Shadows move where trust resides. Act swiftly, or the nation weeps." Watson, standing by the window with a cup of tea in hand, glanced back at his friend. "Holmes, you've been staring at that scrap of paper for nearly an hour. What's to be done? It's vague, possibly a prank." Holmes' lips twitched into a faint smile, though his gaze never left the note. "A prank, Watson? No, the choice of words, the quality of the paper, the precision of the handwriting. This is no jest. It's a calculated gesture, meant to stir us into action without revealing too much. The question is, who benefits from such a warning?" Watson set his cup down, his brow furrowing. "You think it's genuine, then? A plot against the Queen's tiara?" "I think it's a thread, Watson. A single, delicate thread in a tapestry of intrigue, and I intend to pull it until the whole design unravels." Holmes rose abruptly, his dressing gown swirling as he crossed the room to his desk. "We must gain access to Buckingham Palace. If there's a plot afoot, the first clues will be found where the tiara rests." Watson blinked, startled by the sudden shift. "The palace? Holmes, you can't just waltz into the royal residence and demand to poke around. Even you must have limits." Holmes chuckled, a low, dry sound. "Limits, my dear Watson, are for men who lack imagination. Fortunately, I have a connection, a certain Lord Haverford, who owes me a favour from a rather delicate matter involving a forged painting and a Prussian diplomat. He'll secure us an audience, or at least a pretext to enter the palace." By midday, Holmes' prediction proved correct. A telegram arrived from Lord Haverford, confirming an invitation to the palace under the guise of consulting on a matter of security protocol. The pretext was flimsy, but it was enough. Holmes and Watson donned their finest attire in a tailored black coat that gave him the air of a severe academic, and Watson in his old military dress, which lent him a quiet dignity. They hired a hansom cab and set off through the drizzle-soaked streets of London toward the imposing gates of Buckingham Palace. The palace loomed ahead, its stone facade softened by the mist. As their cab approached, a guard in a scarlet uniform stepped forward, his expression stern but professional. Holmes presented Lord Haverford's letter, and after a moment's scrutiny, they were ushered through the gates. The courtyard bustled with activity, servants hurrying with trays, officers conferring in low tones, and a pair of groundskeepers tending to the immaculate lawns. Yet Holmes' eyes darted everywhere, noting the placement of guards, the angles of windows, the rhythm of foot traffic. "Observe, Watson," he murmured as they crossed the courtyard. "The palace is a fortress, yet no fortress is impregnable. Every servant, every shadow, is a potential vulnerability." Watson nodded, though his attention was drawn to the grandeur of their surroundings. The palace's interior was a labyrinth of opulence. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and portraits of monarchs past stared down from gilded frames. A footman led them through a series of corridors to a small oak-panelled room where Lord Haverford awaited. He was a stout man with a florid face and a moustache that seemed to bristle with self-importance. "Mr. Holmes," Dr. Watson Haverford greeted, rising from a leather chair. "I trust you understand the delicacy of this matter. Her Majesty's household is not accustomed to external inquiries." Holmes inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "I assure you, Lord Haverford, our presence will be as unobtrusive as possible. We merely wish to inspect the security arrangements for the Queen's tiara. A routine precaution, nothing more." Haverford's eyes narrowed, but he gestured toward a door at the far end of the room. "Very well. Captain Ellison, the head of the palace guard, will escort you to the vault. I trust you'll find everything in order." Captain Ellison proved to be a tall, wiry man with a soldier's bearing and a face that betrayed no emotion. He led Holmes and Watson through a maze of corridors, down a spiral staircase, and into a stone-walled chamber deep within the palace. The air grew cooler, heavier, as they descended. At the chamber's center stood the vaulter, massive iron door with a complex lock mechanism that gleamed under the flickering gaslight. "Here it is," Ellison said, his voice clipped. "The tiara is kept within, under constant guard. No one enters without authorization from Her Majesty or the Lord Chamberlain." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes scanning the vault's surface. "Impressive," he murmured, though his tone suggested otherwise. He knelt, examining the floor, then ran a finger along the edge of the doorframe. "Tell me, Captain, how many men have access to the key?" Ellison stiffened. "3. Myself, the Lord Chamberlain, and one other trusted deputy. The key never leaves our possession." "And the lock itself?" Holmes asked, his fingers tracing the mechanism. "When was it last serviced?" "6 months ago," Ellison replied, "by a locksmith from the finest firm in London. It's impenetrable." Holmes' lips quirked. "Impenetrable is a bold claim, Captain. Even the finest locks have their weaknesses." He straightened, his gaze flicking to the walls, the ceiling, the floor. "Watson, do you notice anything unusual?" Watson, who had been quietly observing, stepped closer. "The floor, Holmes. There's a faint scuff mark near the vault, door barely visible, but it's there. It's not in keeping with the polish of the rest of the chamber." Holmes nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Well spotted, Watson. A scuff mark, recent and out of place in a room kept immaculate. Someone has been here who shouldn't have been." He turned to Ellison. "Captain, who has access to this chamber besides the key holders?" Ellison hesitated, his jaw tightening. "The guards, of course, a rotating detail of 6 men, all vetted and loyal, and the cleaning staff, but there, escorted at all times." "Escorted," Holmes repeated, his tone thoughtful. Yet a single moment of inattention could be enough. "Tell me, Captain, Have any of your men reported anything unusual? A stranger in the corridors, perhaps, or an unexpected visitor? Ellison shook his head. Nothing out of the ordinary. The palace is secure, Mr. Holmes. I stake my reputation on it. Your reputation is not my concern, Holmes said briskly. The Tiara's safety is. I'd like to speak with your guards and inspect their schedules. Discreetly, of course. Ellison's face darkened, but he nodded. Very well, I'll arrange it. But I warn you, Mr. Holmes, you're chasing shadows. Shadows, Captain, Holmes said softly, are often where the truth hides. The rest of the day was spent in meticulous observation. Holmes and Watson interviewed the guards, each man a picture of discipline. Yet Holmes' questions were relentless, probing their routines, their backgrounds, their interactions with palace staff. Watson watched in admiration as Holmes' mind worked, piecing together fragments of information like a mosaic. A guard's hesitation, a servant's glance, a discrepancy in a logbook were noted, catalogued, and filed away in Holmes' prodigious memory as evening fell. They were granted a brief glimpse of the tiara itself, displayed for a private viewing in a glass case within a heavily guarded salon. The tiara was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, its diamonds catching the candlelight in a cascade of fire. Yet Holmes' attention was not on the jewels, but on the case's lacquer, smaller, more delicate mechanism than the vault's, but no less intricate. Curious, Holmes murmured, leaning close. The case is new, Watson. The lock is pristine, untouched by wear. Yet there's a faint scratch on the glass, barely visible. Someone has tampered with it or tried to. Watson frowned. But the tiara is still there. If someone tried to steal it, they failed. Or they were testing the waters, Holmes replied. A rehearsal, perhaps, for the real attempt. We must assume the plot is already in motion. Their inspection complete, Holmes and Watson returned to the oak-panelled room to confer with Lord Haverford. The man was pacing, his earlier composure fraying. Well, Mr. Holmes, have you found your phantom thief? Not yet, Holmes said, his tone calm but firm. But I have found enough to warrant further investigation. The palace is not as secure as you believe, Lord Haverford. Someone within these walls involves someone with access, knowledge, and motive. Haverford's face reddened. That's preposterous. The staff are loyal, the guards impeccable. You're suggesting treason. I'm suggesting nothing, Holmes said. Coolly, I'm observing. And the evidence suggests an inside job. I'll need a list of every person who has been in or near the vault chamber in the past months. Servants, guards, visitors, all of them. Haverford sputtered, but eventually agreed, promising to deliver the list by morning. As Holmes and Watson stepped back into the misty night, the palace's silhouette loomed behind them, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. Watson glanced at his friend, noting the faint tension in his posture. You're certain, Holmes? He asked quietly. Anne. Inside Job, Holmes' eyes gleamed in the gaslight. As certain as I am that the sun will rise tomorrow, Watson. The scuff mark, the scratch on the case, the warning note all point to someone within the palace's inner circle. The question is not whether they exist, but how deep their betrayal runs. The cab ride back to Baker Street was silent, save for the creak of wheels and the patter of rain. Holmes stared out the window, his mind already racing ahead, weaving connections between the clues they'd uncovered. Watson, meanwhile, felt a growing unease. The palace, a symbol of unyielding strength, now seemed riddled with shadows, that hid a threat to the very heart of the empire. Back at 2 to 1B, Holmes lit his pipe and sank into his armchair, the note from that morning once again in his hand. "Watson," he said after a long silence, "this case is no mere theft. The tiara is a symbol, a prize that could destabilize more than the royal household. We are not hunting a common thief, but a mind or minds capable of orchestrating a conspiracy on a grand scale." Watson nodded, his military instinct stirring. "What's our next move?" Holmes' eyes narrowed, a spark of determination igniting within them. "We wait for Haverford's list, and we watch. The conspirators will move soon, they must, if the tiara is to be stolen before it's transferred to the exhibition, and when they do, we'll be ready." The night stretched on, the fog outside thickening, but within 2 to 1B, the air crackled with the promise of revelation. Holmes and Watson had stepped into a game of shadows, and the stakes were nothing less than the security of the crown itself. Chapter 3. The Enigmatic Invitation. The rain had begun to fall in earnest as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson stepped out of Buckingham Palace into the damp embrace of a London evening. The gas lamps flickered, casting a golden haze over the cobblestones, their reflections shimmering in the puddles that pooled along the pavement. Holmes, his sharp features partially obscured by the brim of his deerstalker, adjusted his coat against the chill. Watson, ever the loyal companion, kept pace beside him, his umbrella raised in a futile attempt to shield them both from the downpour. "An inside job." "Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low but carrying the weight of certainty. "The clues. We uncovered in the palace the scuff on the corridor floor, the misplaced guard's log, the faint scent of French tobacco in a room where none should be point to someone with intimate knowledge of the palace's workings." Watson nodded, his brow furrowed. "But who, Holmes? The staff are vetted, the guards loyal. Surely the Queen's own household wouldn't dare. Never underestimate the audacity of greed." "My dear Watson," Holmes interrupted, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase, "loyalty can be bought, and secrets are currency too. Those who know their value, we must tread carefully. Our next move hinges on what comes next." They turned onto Pall Mall, the rain muffling the clatter of hooves and the distant calls of newsboys hawking the evening papers. The city seemed to hum with secrets, each shadow a potential conspirator. Watson glanced at Holmes, noting the detective's preoccupied air. "You're expecting something, aren't you?" he ventured. Holmes' lips twitched into a faint smile. "You know me too well, Watson." "Yes, I am expecting something. The warning we received, the anonymous note slipped under my door at Baker Street, was no idle jest. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down by someone who knows more than they. Should they want me involved, and I suspect they will not keep me waiting long." As if summoned by his words, a hansom cab rattled to a stop beside them. The driver, a wiry man with a face half hidden by a scarf, leaned down. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, his voice rough but deferential. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "I am he." The driver extended a sealed envelope, its edges damp from the rain. "For you, sir. Told to deliver it here, no questions asked." Without waiting for a response, he flicked the reins, and the cab vanished into the misty street. Holmes turned the envelope over in his gloved hands, examining it with the precision of a surgeon. The paper was of fine quality, the seal a deep crimson wax, stamped with an unfamiliar cresta stylized raven clutching a key. "Curious," he murmured, breaking the seal with a deft motion. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its message: written in a flowing, almost theatrical hand. "Mr. Holmes, your reputation precedes you. If you wish to unravel the threads of a plot that threatens more than you know, come alone to the Black Raven in Whitechapel at midnight tonight. Trust no one, not even those closest to you. A friend awaits." No signature followed, only the same Ravenanki emblem sketched at the bottom. Watson peered over Holmes' shoulder, his expression darkening. "Whitechapel at midnight. This reeks of a trap, Holmes. You can't seriously mean to go?" Holmes folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket, his eyes alight with a dangerous curiosity. "On the contrary, Watson, I must go. Trap or not, this is the next piece of the puzzle. Someone is playing a game, and I intend to learn the rules." Watson's jaw tightened. "Then I'm coming with you." Holmes shook his head. "The letter specifies that I come alone, and I will honor that for now. But rest assured, Watson, I am not so reckless as to walk blindly into danger. You will have your part to play, but tonight I need you to remain at Baker Street, ready to act if I do not return by dawn." Watson opened his mouth to protest, but the steel in Holmes' gaze silenced him. With a reluctant nod, he agreed, though his unease was palpable. They parted ways at the corner of Baker Street, Holmes striding off into the night, his figure swallowed by the fog. The Black Raven Inn was a squat, unassuming building tucked into the labyrinthine alleys of Whitechapel, its sign a faded depiction of a raven with a key in its beak, creaked in the wind. The air here was thick with the smells of stale beer, coal smoke, and desperation. Holmes approached with the wariness of a predator, his senses attuned to every sound, the creak of a shudder, the distant shout of a drunkard, the soft scuffle of footsteps behind him. He paused at the door, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his walking stick, which concealed a slender blade. The inn's interior was dimly lit, its air heavy with tobacco and the murmur of low voices. A few patrons hunched over their drinks, their eyes flicking toward him with suspicion before returning to their own concerns. Holmes scanned the room, his mind cataloguing every detail: the worn bar counter, the flickering oil lamps, the narrow staircase leading to the upper rooms. A barmaid, her face weary but sharp, approached. "You Holmes?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, and she jerked her head toward the staircase. "Upstairs, second room on the left. He's waiting." Holmes ascended the stairs, his footsteps silent on the creaking boards. The second room's door was ajar, a faint glow spilling into the hallway. He pushed it open and stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the light of a single candle on a rickety table. A man sat in the shadows, his features obscured by a hooded cloak. The Ravenand key crest gleamed on a ring he wore, catching the candlelight. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, with a faint trace of an accent Holmes couldn't place. "I am pleased you accepted my invitation." Holmes remained standing, his posture relaxed but alert. "You have the advantage of me, sir. To whom do I owe the pleasure of this clandestine meeting?" The man chuckled, a low, almost mocking sound. "Names are such fragile things, Mr. Holmes. For now, call me Corvus. It suits our purpose." "Very well, Corvus," Holmes said, his tone dry. "You claim to have information about a plot against the Queen's tiara. Speak plainly, or I shall consider this a waste of my time." Corvus leaned forward, the candlelight catching the edge of a scar that ran along his jaw. "The tiara is more than a bauble, Mr. Holmes. It is a symbol, a key to a greater prize. There are those who would use it to destabilize the crown, too. Sow discord among the powers of Europe. The plot you've stumbled upon is but the tip of a much larger iceberg. Holmes' eyes narrowed. And your role in this? Are you the architect, or merely a messenger? Corvus smiled, a flash of white teeth in the dim light. I am a friend, Mr. Holmes, though you may not believe it. I wish to see this plot foiled, but my reasons are my own. The tiara will be stolen during its transfer to the public exhibition. In 3 days' time, the conspirators are closer than you think. Some wear the Queen's livery, others the garb of nobility. Trust no one, not even your faithful doctor. Holmes' expression remained impassive, but his mind raced. The mention of Watson was a deliberate barb, meant to unsettle him. You speak in riddles, Corvus. If you know so much, why not act yourself? Why summon me? Because you, Mr. Holmes, are the only one capable of stopping them, Corvus replied. Your mind is a blade, sharp and unyielding. But beware, there are those who know your methods, who anticipate your moves. They have planned for you, Holmes. Leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. Then they should know I am not so easily outmaneuvered. Give me a name, Corvus, one name to prove your sincerity. Corvus hesitated, then reached into his cloak and produced a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. Lord Reginald Ashburn, he said softly. He is not what he seems. Holmes took the paper, his fingers brushing the coarse surface. He unfolded it to reveal a sketch of the Ravenanki crest. Along with a single line, the vault's weakness is known to few, but he is one, before. Holmes could press further. Corvus stood, pulling his cloak tighter. We will meet again, Mr. Holmes, when the time is right. Until then, guard your steps. He moved to the window, and with a swift motion, was gone, leaving only the flicker of the candle and the echo of his words. Holmes sat for a moment, his mind dissecting every detail of the encounter. Lord Reginald Ashburn was a minor noble, known for his philanthropy and impeccable reputation. Yet Corvus' words, coupled with the clues from the palace, suggested a deeper game. The mention of the vault's weakness was troubling. It aligned with the subtle irregularities Holmes had noted during their inspection. But was Corvus a true ally or a puppet master pulling strings? He left the inn, the rain now a steady drumbeat. Against the city, the streets of Whitechapel were alive with shadows, and Holmes moved through them like a spectre, his thoughts a whirlwind of deduction. Lord Ashburn would bear watching, but so too would this mysterious Corvus. The tiara was indeed a key, but to what lock? Back at 2-1B Baker Street, Watson was pacing, his worry etched into every line of his face. The clock on the mantel ticked toward 1 in the morning, and Holmes had not yet returned. Mrs. Hudson, ever the patient landlady, had left a tray of tea and biscuits, but Watson had no appetite. His thoughts kept returning to the letter, its cryptic warning, and Holmes' insistence on facing it alone. When the door finally creaked open, Watson spun around, relief flooding his features. Holmes, thank God. I was beginning to think. Calm yourself, Watson, Holmes said, shaking the rain from his coat. I am quite intact, though the night has been illuminating. He recounted the meeting with Corvus, omitting no detail, from the man's accent to the scar on his jaw. Watson listened intently, his medical mind noting the precision of Holmes' observations. Lord Ashburn, Watson said, frowning. I've met him at a few functions. He seemed a decent sort, if a bit reserved. Could he really be involved? Holmes lit his pipe, the smoke curling toward the ceiling. Men are rarely what they seem, Watson. Ashburn's public face is impeccable, but that only makes him a more intriguing suspect. Tomorrow we shall attend the gala at Grosvenor House, where he is certain to be. I want to observe him in his element. Watson nodded, though his unease lingered. And this Corvus, can we trust him? Holmes' eyes gleamed in the lamplight. Trust is a luxury we cannot afford, Watson. But information, even from a dubious source, is a weapon. Corvus has given us a thread to pull, and pull it we shall. The next evening, Grosvenor House glittered like a jewel in the heart of Mayfair. The gala was a grand affair, attended by London's elite nobles, politicians, and foreign dignitaries, all draped in finery. Holmes and Watson, dressed in impeccable evening wear, blended seamlessly into the crowd. Holmes' eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle interactions, the fleeting glances, the hands that lingered too long in a handshake. Lord Reginald Ashburn stood near the centre of the ballroom, a tall man with silver hair and a demeanour that exuded quiet authority. He was engaged in conversation with a foreign ambassador, his smile polished but guarded. Holmes watched him closely, noting the way his eyes flicked toward the entrance. As if expecting someone. Watson, Holmes murmured, keep an eye on the ambassador. I want to know who he speaks to next. I'll approach Ashburn. Before Watson could respond, Holmes glided through the crowd, his movements as precise as a dancer's. He positioned himself near Ashburn, feigning interest in a nearby painting. The nobleman's conversation with the ambassador ended, and he excused himself, moving toward a side door. Holmes followed at a discreet distance, his senses attuned to every detail, the faint creak of the door, the muffled sound of footsteps on carpet. The side door led to a quiet corridor where Ashburn met a man in a servant's uniform. Their exchange was brief, their voices too low for Holmes to catch, but the servant handed Ashburn a small object, which the nobleman quickly pocketed. Holmes' eyes narrowed. A key, a note. The exchange was too deliberate to be innocent. As Ashburn returned to the ballroom, Holmes slipped back into the crowd, his mind racing. The servant's face was unfamiliar, but his uniform bore the crest of Buckingham Palace. Another piece of the puzzle, and yet the picture remained maddeningly incomplete. Watson rejoined him, his expression grim. The ambassador spoke to a man named Victor Dragomir, a Hungarian diplomat with a reputation for unorthodox business dealings. They seemed overly familiar for a casual acquaintance. Holmes nodded, his mind cataloguing the new information. Dragomir, Ashburn, and now a palace servant. The web grows tighter, Watson, but we must be cautious. Corvus warned of betrayal, and I fear we are surrounded by it. The following day, Holmes and Watson returned to Buckingham Palace, this time to examine the vault more closely. The tiara, a masterpiece of diamonds and sapphires, rested on a velvet cushion behind layers of steel and glass. The vault's security was formidable, but Holmes' earlier inspection had revealed a subtle floor maintenance panel that, while locked, could be accessed with the right tools and knowledge. As they studied the vault, a guard approached, his expression uneasy. "Mr. Holmes, there's something you should see." He led them to a storage room nearby, where a crate had been pried open. Inside were tools, lockpicks, a small drill, and a diagram of the vault's locking mechanism. Holmes examined the diagram, his fingers tracing the precise lines. "This is no amateur's work, Watson. Someone with expertise in security systems created this, and they left it here, knowing it would be found. A taunt, Watson asked. Or a distraction, Holmes replied. The conspirators want us to focus on the vault, but I suspect the real plan lies elsewhere. The tiara's transfer to the exhibition is the critical moment. That's when they'll strike. Over the next 2 days, Holmes and Watson worked tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of the conspiracy. Holmes tracked the servant from the gala, identifying him as Thomas Reed, a palace footman with a suspiciously clean record. Watson, meanwhile, dug into Dragomir's background, uncovering ties to a shadowy syndicate rumoured to deal in stolen antiquities. Lord Ashburn remained elusive, his public appearances carefully choreographed, but Holmes' observations at the gala had confirmed Corvus' warning there was something off about the man. A tension in his posture that betrayed hidden motives. On the eve of the tiara's transfer, Holmes received another letter, delivered to Baker Street in the same crimson-sealed envelope. This time, the message was brief. The Raven watches. The East End, tomorrow night. Be there, or the tiara is lost. Holmes burned the letter in the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Tomorrow, Watson, we move. The game is afoot, and I intend to win it. The East End was a stark contrast to the opulence of Mayfair. Its narrow streets were cloaked in fog, the air heavy with the stench of industry and poverty. Holmes and Watson, disguised as dock workers, moved through the shadows. There. Chapter 4. Footprints in the fog. The night was thick with fog, a heavy, swirling shroud that clung to London's streets like a living thing. Gas lamps flickered weakly, their pale glow barely piercing the mist that rolled in from the Thames, turning the city into a labyrinth of shadows. Sherlock Holmes stood at the edge of Baker Street, his sharp eyes scanning the gloom, his Inverness cape drawn tight against the damp chill. Beside him, Dr. John Watson shifted uneasily, his hand resting on the reassuring weight of his service revolver in his coat pocket. Holmes, Watson whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant clatter of a hansom cab. Are you certain this is wise? Chasing a shadow in this fog seems a fool's errand. Holmes' lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, though his gaze remained fixed on the street ahead. Fool's errand or not, Watson, our quarry is out there. The cryptic note we received at the palace mentioned a meeting tonight near the docks. If we are to uncover the plot to steal the Queen's tiara, we must follow the trail, however faint. The note in question had been delivered to their lodgings earlier that evening, slipped under the door by an unseen hand. It was written in a hurried scrawl, the ink smudged as though penned in haste. Midnight. Near the old warehouse on Wapping Lane. The shadow moves. Trust no one. Holmes had studied it for no more than a moment before declaring they would pursue the lead. Watson, ever the loyal companion, had agreed, though not without a pang of apprehension. The fog, the hour, the cryptic warning, it all felt like a trap. They moved silently through the streets, Holmes leading the way with the certainty of a bloodhound on the scent. His long strides ate up the cobblestones, and Watson struggled to keep pace, his eyes straining to make out shapes in the fog. The city was eerily quiet, the usual clamour of London muffled by the dense mist. Only the occasional creak of a sign swinging in the breeze or the distant bark of a dog broke the silence. As they approached the East End, the air grew heavier, tinged with the acrid smell of coal smoke and the briny tank of the river. Wapping Lane was a narrow, cobbled street lined with crumbling warehouses and derelict buildings, their windows dark and uninviting. The fog was thicker here, curling around the corners of the buildings like ghostly fingers. Holmes paused at the mouth of the lane, his silhouette sharp against the faint glow of a nearby lamp. "There," he murmured, pointing to a faint scuff mark on the cobblestones, barely visible in the dim light. "A fresh footprint. Our shadow has passed this way." Watson squinted at the mark, a shallow indentation in the damp stone. "Holmes, how can you be sure it's recent? This street sees plenty of traffic." Holmes crouched, his gloved fingers brushing the edge of the print. "Observe the edges, Watson. They're crisp, untouched by the settling dew. This was made within the hour. And note the size narrow with a pronounced arch. A man's boot, likely a gentleman's, given the quality of the sole. Our shadow is no common dock worker." Watson nodded, though his skepticism lingered. Holmes' ability to glean such details from the smallest clues never ceased to amaze him, but it also left him feeling perpetually one step behind. "Very well," he said. "Lead on." They followed the trail of footprints, faint and sporadic, through the twisting alleys of Wapping. The fog seemed to thicken with every step, reducing visibility to a mere few feet. Holmes moved with purpose, his eyes darting from the ground to the surrounding buildings, as though mapping the unseen in his mind. Watson kept close, his senses heightened, every rustle or distant footfall setting his nerves on edge. At length, they reached a derelict warehouse at the end of the lane. Its walls were blackened with soot, and the windows were boarded up, save for one that hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. The footprints led directly to the door, which stood slightly open, a sliver of darkness beckoning within. Holmes raised a hand, signaling Watson to stop. He tilted his head, listening intently. From within the warehouse came the faint murmur of voices, low and guarded, punctuated by the occasional clink of metal. Holmes' eyes gleamed with the thrill of the chase. "Our quarry is inside," he whispered. "We must proceed with caution. If this is indeed the meeting mentioned in the note, we may be walking into the heart of the conspiracy." Watson tightened his grip on his revolver. "What's the plan, Holmes?" "We observe," Holmes replied. "We listen. We do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Our goal is information, not confrontation. Follow my lead and keep your weapon at the ready." They slipped through the door, moving as silently as the fog itself. The interior of the warehouse was a cavernous space, cluttered with crates and barrels, the air thick with the musty smell of damp wood and rust. A faint light flickered from deeper within, casting long shadows across the floor. Holmes gestured toward a stack of crates, and they took cover behind it. Peering through a narrow gap in the center of the warehouse, illuminated by a single lantern, stood three figures. Two were rough-looking men, their clothes stained with the grime of the docks, their faces half hidden by the brims of their caps. The third was different at all, slender figure cloaked in a dark overcoat, his face obscured by a scarf. His posture was erect, his movements precise, betraying a refinement that set him apart from his companions. The gala is the key," the cloaked figure was saying, his voice low but clear, with a faint accent Watson couldn't place. "The Tiara will be vulnerable during the transfer. Our man inside has ensured the guards will be distracted." One of the rough men shifted uneasily, "And the detective? They say Holmes is sniffing around. He's dangerous." The cloaked figure laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the empty space. "Holmes is a nuisance, nothing more. He chases shadows, not facts. By the time he pieces it together, the Tiara will be ours." Watson glanced at Holmes, expecting to see indignation. But his friend's face was a mask of calm calculation. Holmes' eyes were fixed on the cloaked figure, as though memorizing every detail of his form. The conversation continued, the men discussing routes, timings, and a mysterious buyer who awaited the Tiara in Paris. Holmes listened intently, his fingers twitching as though itching to take notes. Watson, meanwhile, felt a growing unease. The fog outside seemed to press against the warehouse, isolating them in this den of conspirators. If they were discovered, escape would be difficult. Suddenly, a board creaked under Watson's foot. The sound was faint, but in the stillness of the warehouse, it might as well have been a gunshot. The three figures froze, their heads snapping toward the crates. Who's there? One of the rough men barked, drawing a knife from his belt. Holmes seized Watson's arm, pulling him deeper into the shadows. Run, he hissed, and they bolted toward the door, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. Shouts erupted behind them, followed by the thud of boots in pursuit. They burst out into the fog, the cold air biting at their lungs as they sprinted down the lane. The fog was both ally and enemy, concealing them but also hiding their pursuers. Holmes veered sharply, into a side alley, then another, his knowledge of London's labyrinthine streets guiding them through the maze. Watson followed, his heart pounding, the weight of his revolver a small comfort. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but Holmes didn't slow. He led them through a series of narrow passages, doubling back and weaving through the fog until they emerged onto a broader street near the river. Only then did he stop, his breath coming in controlled gasps, his eyes scanning the mist for any sign of their pursuers. I believe we've lost them, he said at last, his voice steady despite the chase, but we must not linger. The fog may hide us, but it also hides them. Watson leaned against a lamppost, catching his breath. Who was that man, Holmes? The one in the cloak? He spoke as though he knew you. Holmes' expression darkened, a rare flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. I cannot be certain, Watson, but his voice. There was something familiar in it, a cadence I've heard before, though I cannot yet place it. He is no ordinary criminal, that much is clear. His knowledge of the palace, his confidence in outwitting Isid, suggests a mind of considerable cunning. And the tiara, Watson. Pressed, what did he mean about the gala? Holmes' eyes narrowed. The gala at Buckingham Palace, 3 nights hence. The Queen's tiara is to be displayed as part of a public exhibition, a gesture of goodwill to the visiting dignitaries. It will be moved from the vault to the ballroom for the event a moment of vulnerability, as our cloaked friend so helpfully confirmed. Watson frowned. But how could they know the guard's movements? That suggests an inside job, Holmes finished, his voice grim. Precisely what I suspected. Someone within the palace is feeding information to this syndicate. We must return to Baker Street and review our notes. The pieces are falling into place, but we are running out of time. They made their way back through the fog, the city slowly coming to life around them as the first hints of dawn crept through the mist. Holmes was silent, his mind clearly racing, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. Watson, too, was lost in thought, replaying the cloaked figure's words in his mind. Holmes is a nuisance, nothing more. The arrogance of the statement rankled, but it also fueled his determination to see the case through. Back at 2-1B Baker Street, the fire was burning low, and Mrs. Hudson greeted them with a tray of tea and a stern look for their dishevelled appearance. Holmes ignored her, striding to his desk and pulling out a map of London, along with the cryptic note and his notes from their palace visit. "Watson," he said, spreading the map across the table, "we must consider the logistics. The gala is in 3 days. The Tiara will be moved under heavy guard, but our conspirators have a plan to exploit a distraction. We need to identify the traitor within the palace and anticipate their next move." Watson sat across from him, sipping his tea. "What about the cloaked man? You think he's the mastermind?" Holmes shook his head. "Unlikely. He is a key player, certainly, but his role feels ... intermediary. The true mastermind would not risk exposure in a warehouse meeting. No, there is someone else pulling the strings, someone with the resources and intellect to orchestrate a theft of this magnitude." He traced a finger along the map, marking the route from Buckingham Palace to the gala's venue. The Tiara's transfer will likely occur along this route. We must scout it tomorrow. Look for vulnerabilities, alleys, blind spots, places where a distraction could be staged. Watson nodded, though exhaustion was beginning to creep in. "And the footprint? You said it was a gentleman's boot. Could it belong to our cloaked friend?" "Possibly," Holmes said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes distant. "But we cannot assume. The footprint is a clue, but not definitive. We need more names, connections, motives. The coded message we found in the palace may hold the key. I shall spend the morning deciphering it further." Watson stifled a yawn. "And what of tonight's adventure? Did we learn enough to justify the risk?" Holmes' gaze softened, a rare moment of warmth breaking through his usual reserve. "My dear Watson, every step we take, every risk we run, brings us closer to the truth. Tonight we confirmed the gala as the target and the existence of an inside man. That is no small victory." Watson smiled faintly, reassured by Holmes' confidence. "Then what's next?" "Sleep, Watson," Holmes said, rising from his chair. "We have a long day ahead. Tomorrow we return to the palace, and I shall have a word with the guards. One of them, I suspect, is not what he seems." As Watson retired to his room, the fog outside began to lift, revealing the first streaks of dawn. But the mystery of the Queen's tiara remained shrouded, its secrets hidden in the shadows of London's underworld. Holmes stood at the window, staring out into the fading mist, his mind already racing toward the next clue, the next footprint in the fog. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Holmes, true to his word, spent the morning poring over the coded message they had found tucked into a hollowed-out book in the palace library. It was a complex cipher, one that required all his considerable intellect to unravel. Watson, meanwhile, busied himself with compiling a list of the palace guards, cross-referencing their backgrounds with any known criminal connections. It was tedious work, but necessary, and Watson took pride in his role as Holmes' steadfast partner. By midday, Holmes had made progress on the cipher, though not without frustration. "It as a variation of a Vigenère cipher," he muttered, scribbling furiously in his notebook. "The key is a phrase, likely related to the tiara itself. I've narrowed it down to a few possibilities, but I need more context." Watson looked up from his own notes. Could it be something to do with the gala or the syndicate the cloaked man mentioned? Holmes nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. Possibly. The syndicate is the key, Watson. An international operation, with a buyer in Paris. This is no petty theft, it's a calculated move, likely tied to political or financial gain. The tiara is not just a jewel, it's a symbol. The rest of the day was spent preparing for their return to the palace. Holmes insisted on disguises simple ones to avoid drawing attention. He donned the garb of a maintenance worker, complete with a false moustache and a cap pulled low over his eyes. Watson, less comfortable with deception, settled for a plain suit and a pair of spectacles that gave him a scholarly air. At the palace, they gained entry under the pretense of inspecting the vault's ventilation system. The guards, preoccupied with preparations for the gala, paid them little mind. Holmes moved with purpose, his eyes scanning every detail: the placement of the guards, the timing of their patrols, the layout of the corridors leading to the vault. Watson followed, taking mental notes, his hand never far from his revolver. In the vault room, Holmes lingered, ostensibly checking the air vents, but in truth examining the locking mechanism. A flaw, he murmured, pointing to a small gap in the vault door's frame. Not obvious, but enough for a skilled thief to exploit. Someone knew of this, Watson. Someone with access. They left the palace with more questions than answers. But Holmes was undeterred. "We are closing in," he said as they walked back to Baker Street. "The cipher, the footprint, the cloaked man, they are all threads in the same tapestry. We need only pull the right one to unravel the plot." That evening, Holmes returned to the cipher, his focus absolute. Watson, unable to keep up with his friend's relentless pace, retired early, but not before extracting a promise from Holmes to rest. "You'll be no use to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion," he said sternly. Holmes waved him off, but there was a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Rest assured, Watson, I shall sleep when the Tiara is safe. Until then, the game is afoot." And so it went, the hours ticking by as Holmes worked through the night. The fog outside a constant reminder of the shadows they chased. The plot to steal the Queen's tiara was coming into focus, but the danger was far from over. In the streets of London, the conspirators were moving, their plans drawing ever closer to fruition. And somewhere, in the heart of the city, a cloaked figure watched, waiting for the moment to strike. Chapter 5. The Code of the Crimson Jewel. The fog had settled over London like a shroud, its tendrils curling through the narrow alleys and clinging to the cobblestones of Baker Street. Inside 221B, the air was thick with the scent of pipe tobacco and the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed on a crumpled piece of paper that lay on the table before him. The paper, stained with ink and creased from rough handling, bore a series of seemingly random numbers and letters, scrawled in a hasty hand. To the untrained eye, it was gibberish. To Holmes, it was a cipher puzzle begging to be solved. Dr. John Watson, seated across from him, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Holmes, you've been staring at that scrap for hours. Surely it's just some madman's scribblings. What could it possibly tell us about the tiara?" Holmes' lips twitched into a faint smile, though his eyes never left the paper. "My dear Watson, you underestimate the power of the written word. This is no mere scribbling. It is a code, and codes, when broken, reveal truths that even the most guarded tongues cannot conceal. This paper holds the key to the plot against the Queen's tiara. I am certain of it." Watson sighed, accustomed to Holmes' cryptic pronouncements, but no less frustrated by them. "And how, pray tell, do you intend to make sense of it? It's nothing but numbers and letters thrown together without rhyme or reason." Holmes leaned back, his gaze sharpening. "There is always reason, Watson. The human mind, even in its most devious forms, craves order. This cipher is no exception. Observe the structure. 5 groups of 4 characters each, alternating between numbers and letters. It suggests a substitution cipher, perhaps layered with transposition for added complexity. The key lies in discerning the pattern. He rose abruptly, crossing the room to retrieve a worn leather notebook from a cluttered shelf. Flipping it open, he began jotting down the cipher's contents: 7B 4K9 M2 P3 F8J 6T 1Q5 R9N. The firelight cast long shadows across his angular features. As he muttered to himself, his pencil scratching furiously, Watson watched, his curiosity piqued despite his skepticism. "You think this came from the figure you chased last night?" "The one in the fog, undoubtedly," Holmes replied, not looking up. The man was no ordinary thief. His movements were calculated, his escape too precise. He dropped this paper deliberately, Watson, not out of carelessness, but as a taunt. He wants us to know he's playing a deeper game. Watson frowned. Recalling the previous night's pursuit, it had begun with a tip from one of Holmes' informants, a street urchin named Wiggins, who had overheard whispers of a meeting near the Thames. Holmes, ever alert to the undercurrents of London's criminal world, had insisted they follow the lead. The chase had led them through the labyrinthine alleys of Whitechapel, where the fog had been so thick that Watson could scarcely see his own hand before his face. They had glimpsed a cloaked figure slipping into the shadows, and though Holmes had given chase with his usual relentless vigor, the man had vanished into the night, leaving only the crumpled paper behind. "And you're certain this is connected to the tiara?" Watson pressed. "It could be unrelated, a smuggler's code, or some petty gang's scheme." Holmes shook his head, his eyes gleaming with intensity. "No, Watson. The timing, the location, the very nature of the cipher, it all points to the tiara. The Queen's jewel is no mere bauble. It is a symbol, a relic of imperial power. Its theft would be a blow to the crown's prestige, and there are those who would pay dearly for such a coup. This cipher is the thread that will lead us to them." He fell silent, his attention returning to the notebook. For the next hour, the only sounds in the room were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of paper as Holmes tested various decryption methods. Watson, accustomed to his friend's periods of intense focus, busied himself with a medical journal, though his thoughts kept drifting back to the case. The warning about the tiara had come only days ago, delivered in a cryptic note slipped under their door at Baker Street. Since then, Holmes had been a man possessed, piecing together fragments of information with a ferocity that left Watson both awed and exhausted at last. Holmes let out a low exclamation. "Aha, the Vigenère cipher," with a twist. He looked up, his face alight with triumph. "The key is crimson. Observe. Watson, the word crimson aligns with the numerical values when mapped to a standard alphabet. The letters serve as a secondary layer, misdirecting the casual observer, but with the correct key, the message becomes clear." He scribbled furiously, aligning the ciphertext with the key word. Watson leaned over, trying to follow the process, but the intricacies of Holmes' method were beyond him. After several minutes, Holmes sat back, a satisfied glint in his eye. He slid the notebook toward Watson, who read the decrypted message aloud. "Tiara to syndicate soon." Watson's eyes widened. "Good Lord, Holmes, the tiara is to be handed to a syndicate. But who are they, and when is soon?" Holmes tapped the paper thoughtfully. "That, Watson, is the question. The syndicate is no ordinary band of thieves. The tiara's value lies not only in its jewels, but in its political significance. Its theft could destabilize alliances, embolden foreign powers, or fund some nefarious enterprise. We must uncover the syndicate's identity and their plans before soon becomes now. He rose, pacing the room with restless energy. The figure from last night is our link. His knowledge of the cipher suggests he is no mere foot soldier, but a key player in this plot. We must trace his movements, identify his associates, and determine how he came by this code. Watson nodded, though his mind was still reeling. But where do we start? The man disappeared into the fog. He could be anywhere in London by now. Holmes paused by the window, peering out into the misty street. Not anywhere, Watson. Criminals, like all creatures, are bound by habit. He will return to his haunts, and we shall be waiting. But first, we must consult an old acquaintance, one who knows the underbelly of this city better than most. Watson raised an eyebrow. You mean Shinwell Johnson? Holmes confirmed, already reaching for his coat. He's our best chance of navigating the criminal networks that may shield our quarry. Come, Watson, time is of the essence. The journey to Shinwell Johnson's lodgings took them through the heart of London's East End, where the fog was even denser, muffling the sounds of clattering hooves and distant shouts. Johnson, a reformed criminal who had once run afoul of the law but now served as one of Holmes' most reliable informants, lived in a cramped flat above a tavern in Spitalfields. The air inside was heavy with the smell of stale beer and cheap tobacco, and Johnson himself, a burly man with a scarred face and a surprisingly shrewd gaze, greeted them with a nod. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, he said, gesturing to a pair of rickety chairs. Didn't expect to see you so soon. What's the trouble? Holmes wasted no time. A plot to steal the Queen's tiara. We have reason to believe an international syndicate is involved, and last night we encountered a man who dropped this. He handed Johnson the cipher paper. It's a coded message, now decrypted, indicating the tiara is to be delivered to the syndicate soon. Can you shed light on any groups with the means and motive to orchestrate such a heist? Johnson studied the paper, his brow furrowing. A syndicate, eh? That's big game, even for London's underworld. Most of the local gangs wouldn't dare touch the crown's jewels, too much heat. But there's been talk of foreigners moving in. Men with accents, flashing money around, asking questions about the palace. I heard whispers of a group calling themselves the Crimson Veil. Holmes' eyes narrowed. The Crimson Veil? Tell me more. Johnson leaned back, lighting a cigarette. Not much to tell, I'm afraid. They're a shadowy lot, keep to themselves. Word is they're based somewhere on the continent Germany, maybe, or France. They've got deep pockets and deeper connections. Smugglers, spies, maybe even some highborn types pulling the strings. If they're after the tiara, they've got a plan, and it won't be simple. Holmes nodded, his mind clearly racing. And they're operatives in London. Have you names, descriptions? Johnson shrugged. No names, but I heard one of their runners is a tall cove, always cloaked, moves like a ghost. They call him the Wraith. Might be your man from last night. Watson glanced at Holmes, who gave a slight nod. The description matched a figure they had chased, tall, cloaked, and maddeningly elusive. Where might we find this Wraith? Holmes asked. Johnson exhaled a plume of smoke. He's been seen around the docks, near Wapping. There's a tavern there, the Black Anchor. Shady place, full of sailors and worse. If the wraith's working for the crimson veil, that's where you'll pick up his trail. Holmes rose, his expression resolute. Thank you, Johnson. Your assistance, as always, is invaluable. Watson, we must make for the docks at once. The Black Anchor was a grim establishment, its windows grimy and its interior lit by flickering oil lamps that cast eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and cheap gin, and the patrons a mix of dock workers, sailors, and less savoury types cast wary glances at Holmes and Watson as they entered. Holmes, ever adept at blending into any environment, adopted a slouched posture and a rougher tone, passing himself off as a disgraced clerk looking for work. Watson, less comfortable with deception, followed his lead, keeping his eyes sharp for any sign of their quarry. They took a table in a corner, ordering 2 pints of ale to maintain their cover. Holmes' gaze swept the room, cataloguing every face, every gesture. The wraith will not show himself openly, he murmured, but his associates may. Look for men who seem out of place, too polished, too watchful. Watson nodded, scanning the crowd. Most of the patrons were rough-hewn, their hands calloused from labour, but one man caught his eye. He sat alone near the bar, his clothes slightly too fine for the Settinger-tailored coat, a silk cravat. His eyes darted nervously, as though expecting trouble. Watson nudged Holmes. That one, by the bar. He doesn't belong. Holmes followed Watson's gaze, his expression unreadable. Well observed, Watson. Let us test his mettle. They approached the bar, Holmes striking up a casual conversation with the barkeep, while Watson kept an eye on the stranger. The man's unease grew as Holmes' voice carried, mentioning work for those with quick hands and quicker wits. It was a bait, carefully worded to draw attention without revealing their purpose. The stranger stiffened, his hand slipping toward his pocket. Holmes noticed the movement at once. Watson, now, he hissed, before the man could draw whatever weapon he carried. Holmes was upon him, seizing his wrist with surprising strength. The stranger struggled, but Holmes' grip was iron. "Who are you working for?" Holmes demanded, his voice low and menacing. "Speak, or I'll ensure the constables take an interest in your affairs." The man's eyes widened in panic. I don't know what you mean. I'm just here for a drink." Holmes twisted the man's arm, eliciting a yelp. "Do not insult my intelligence. You are no dock worker, and that cravat cost more than this. Tavern earns in a week. Who sent you the crimson veil?" The name struck a nerve. The man's face paled, and he stammered, "I don't know no crimson veil. I swear it." But Holmes was relentless. He leaned closer, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You lie poorly. Tell me what you know of the tiara, or I shall deduce it. From the contents of your pockets." The man's resistance crumbled. All right. I don't know much, I swear. I'm just a courier. They told me to deliver a message to a man called the Wraith. Something about a jewel, a big one. Said it was going to the continent, to some fancy buyer. That's all I know." Holmes released him, though his eyes remained cold. "Where and when is this delivery to take place?" The man hesitated, then muttered, "Tomorrow night, at the old warehouse on Cutler Street, midnight." Holmes stepped back, his expression inscrutable. "Go, and if you warn your masters, I will find you." The man scrambled to his feet and fled, leaving his untouched drink behind. Watson watched him go, his heart pounding. "Do you believe him, Holmes?" Holmes nodded slowly, enough to act on it. The warehouse on Cutler Street will be our next move. But we must be cautious, Watson. The Crimson Veil will not take kindly to our interference. The following night, the fog was thicker than ever, cloaking the docks in an almost impenetrable haze. The warehouse on Cutler Street stood derelict, its windows boarded and its walls streaked with grime. Holmes and Watson approached with care, their footsteps muffled by the damp cobblestones. Holmes had insisted on disguises, rough coats and caps to blend with the dockside crowd. Watson felt a familiar mix of exhilaration and dread as they neared their destination. Holmes paused at the warehouse's entrance, his senses alert. "The Wraith will be here," he murmured, "and with him answers. Stay close, Watson, and keep your revolver ready." They slipped inside, the darkness swallowing them. The warehouse was vast, its interior a maze of crates and rusted machinery. A faint light flickered in the distance, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. Holmes moved like a shadow, Watson following as quietly as he could. They crouched behind a stack of crates, peering at the scene unfolding before them. 3 men stood in a circle, illuminated by a single lantern. One was tall and cloaked the Wraith, no doubt. The others were less distinct, but their accents marked them as foreigners, perhaps German or Dutch. They spoke in hushed tones, their words barely audible. "The tiara must be secured before the exhibition," one said. "The buyer is impatient." The Wraith's voice was cold, precise. "It will be done. The vault's floor has been confirmed. Our man inside will ensure access." Holmes' eyes gleamed in the darkness. He leaned toward Watson, whispering, "The vault's floor. That is our next lead, but we must know more." Before Watson could respond, a board creaked beneath his foot. The sound was faint, but in the silence of the warehouse, it was deafening. The men froze, their heads snapping toward the crates. "Who's there?" The Wraith barked, his hand darting to his side. Holmes cursed under his breath. "Run, Watson." They bolted, the warehouse erupting into chaos. The men gave chase, their shouts echoing through the cavernous space. Holmes led the way, weaving through the maze with uncanny precision, but the Wraith was fast, his cloaked figure gaining ground. Watson's heart pounded as he clutched his revolver, praying he wouldn't need to use it. They burst into the street, the fog enveloping them once more. Holmes darted into an alley, pulling Watson with him. They pressed against the wall, holding their breath as the Wraith and his men passed by, their footsteps fading into the night. Watson exhaled, his nerves frayed. "That was too close, Holmes. What now?" Holmes' expression was grim but determined. "We know the syndicate's plan hinges on a flaw in the palace vault. Tomorrow we will inspect it ourselves, and we must identify their inside man before it's too late." As they slipped back into the fog, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that the Crimson Veil was watching, waiting for their next move. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot, and the stakes had never been higher. The next morning, Holmes and Watson stood before the imposing gates of Buckingham Palace, their credentials from Scotland Yard granting them access. The palace was a hive of activity, with guards and servants bustling about in preparation for the Tiara's upcoming exhibition. Holmes, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, exuded an air of authority that silenced any questions. Watson, less comfortable in such surroundings, kept his focus on the task at hand. They were led to the vault, a massive iron door set deep within the palace's lower levels. The head of security, a stern man named Captain Harrow, accompanied them, his expression wary. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, the vault is impregnable. No one could breach it without raising the alarm. Holmes' smile was thin. No system is without its weaknesses, Captain. Let us see for ourselves. The vault's interior was a marvel of engineering. Its walls lined with steel, and its locking mechanism a labyrinth of gears and tumblers. Holmes examined every inch, his magnifying glass glinting in the dim light. Watson watched, marveling at his friend's meticulousness. After nearly an hour, Holmes paused, his gaze fixed on a small panel near the lock. "Interesting," he murmured. "This panel is newer than the rest. The screws are freshly oiled, the metal Someone has tampered with it." Captain Harrow frowned. "Impossible. Only a handful of men have access to this vault, and they're all trusted." Holmes straightened, his eyes sharp. "Trust, Captain, is a fragile thing. I suggest you review your men's backgrounds. One of them is not what he seems." As they left the vault, Watson's mind raced. The cipher, the wraith, the crimson veil. The vault's flotted was all coming together, but the picture was still incomplete. "Holmes," he said quietly, "if there's a traitor in the palace, how do we find him?" Holmes' gaze was distant, his mind already working through the possibilities. "We follow the threads, Watson. The cipher has given us the syndicate's intent. The vault has given us their method. Now we must uncover their agent. And I suspect our next clue lies with the gala tomorrow night." Watson nodded, though a sense of unease settled over him. The gala, a grand event attended by London's elite, would be the perfect stage for a heist or a confrontation. As they stepped back into the daylight, the weight of the case pressed heavily on Watson's shoulders. The Queen's tiara, and perhaps the stability of the empire itself, hung in the balance. Chapter 6. The disguised aristocrat. The gaslights of London flickered like uncertain stars against the velvet night, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Mayfair. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson sat in a hansom cab, the steady clop of hooves punctuating the quiet hum of their conversation. The cab swayed gently as it navigated the labyrinthine streets, its destination a grand townhouse where a gala was already in full swing, the glow from its windows spilling onto the pavement like molten gold. The air was thick with anticipation, for tonight's event was no ordinary affair, was hosted by Lord Reginald Ashburn, a man whose name had surfaced in Holmes' inquiries with troubling frequency. Holmes leaned back, his sharp features illuminated intermittently by the passing. His fingers steepled beneath his chin, a familiar sign of deep contemplation. Watson, seated opposite, adjusted his collar, feeling the weight of the evening's purpose. They had come to observe, to probe, to uncover the cryptic clues surrounding the plot to steal the Queen's tiara had led them here, to this opulent gathering of London's elite, where secrets were as common as the diamonds glittering on the necks of the aristocracy. "Lord Ashburn," Holmes murmured, his voice low, almost lost in the creak of the cab. A man of impeccable pedigree, yet his recent behavior betrays a certain restlessness. His financial records show irregularities, sudden influxes of capital from sources he has not disclosed. And then there's his peculiar interest in the palace's security arrangements. Watson frowned, his moustache twitching. "You suspect he's involved in the heist? A nobleman of his standing?" Holmes' lips curved into a faint, sardonic smile. "Nobility, Watson, is no shield against ambition or desperation. Ashburn's demeanour at the palace last week, his lingering near the vault, his overly casual inquiries about the tiara's transports, jests more than idle curiosity. Tonight, We shall see if his mask slips. The cab slowed, and the driver called out their arrival. The townhouse loomed before them, its facade a symphony of Palladian elegance, with tall columns framing the entrance. Music drifted from within, a lilting waltz entwined with the murmur of voices and the clink of champagne flutes. Footmen in pristine livery stood at attention, ushering guests through the grand doors. Holmes and Watson alighted, their invitations procured. Through one of Holmes' discreet contacts clutched in gloved hands. Inside, the gala was a spectacle of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the ballroom, where men in tailcoats and women in silks swirled in a kaleidoscope of color. The air was heavy with the scent of perfume and cigar smoke, and the buzz of conversation formed a constant undercurrent, like the hum of a beehive. Watson's eyes darted about, taking in the grandeur, while Holmes' gaze was razor-sharp, scanning the crowd for their quarry. "There," Holmes said, nodding subtly toward a man standing near a marble fireplace. Lord Reginald Ashburn was unmistakable, his tall frame clad in a perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair swept back with aristocratic precision. He held a glass of champagne, but his eyes were restless, flitting from guest to guest as though searching for something or someone. "He doesn't look like a criminal mastermind," Watson whispered, his tone skeptical. "Few do," Holmes replied, his voice dry. "Observe his hands, Watson. The way he grips that glass too tight, as though steadying himself, and his posture stiff, not the relaxed confidence of a man at ease in his own home. Something weighs on him." They moved through the crowd, blending seamlessly with the throng. Holmes had donned a subtle disguiser, pair of spectacles, and a slight alteration to his posture that made him appear less formidable, more like a scholarly acquaintance of Watson's than the great detective. Watson, for his part, played the role of a genial doctor, his affable demeanor disarming to those who might otherwise take note of their presence as they circulated. Holmes' attention never strayed far from Ashburn. The nobleman was engaged in conversation with a group of foreign dignitaries, his laughter too loud, his gestures too animated. Watson, catching snippets of the exchange, noted the mention of security measures and royal exhibitions, phrases that seemed innocuous in context, but carried weight in light of their investigation. "Holmes," Watson murmured, sidling closer. "He's talking about the Tiara's display next week." Could he be fishing for information? "Or planting it," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. "Stay close, Watson. I want to see who he speaks to next." They lingered near a buffet table laden with delicacies, pretending to sample the fare, while keeping Ashburn in their peripheral vision. The nobleman excused himself from the dignitaries and moved toward a quieter corner of the room, where a woman in a deep emerald gown awaited. She was striking, her dark hair pinned in an elaborate updo, her expression one of poised expectancy. Holmes' interest sharpened. "Countess Elena Markov," he said under his breath, identifying her instantly. "A Russian émigré with ties to several questionable enterprises in Paris. Her presence here is no coincidence." Watson raised an eyebrow. "You think she's part of the plot?" "I think," Holmes said, "that Ashburn's choice of confidant is telling. Let us endeavor to overhear their conversation." They maneuvered closer, using the crowd as cover. Holmes plucked a glass of champagne from a passing tray, holding it as a prop while he edged toward a velvet curtain that partially shielded Ashburn and the Countess. Watson followed, his heart quickening with the thrill of espionage. The music swelled, masking their approach, and they positioned themselves just out of sight, close enough to catch the low murmur of voices. The arrangements are nearly complete, Ashburn was saying, his tone hushed but urgent. The vault's floor is exploitable, but we must act before the transfer. The Countess' voice was smooth, accented with a faint Slavic lilt, and the syndicate, they grow impatient. They expect results, Reginald. They'll have them, Ashburn snapped, his composure fraying. But we cannot afford mistakes. Holmes' sniffing around Di saw him at the palace, asking questions. Watson's breath caught, and he glanced at Holmes, whose expression remained impassive, though his eyes gleamed with interest. Holmes is a nuisance, the Countess said dismissively. But he is only one man. Our plans are too far advanced for him to unravel. Perhaps, Ashburn said, but his voice lacked conviction. Still, we must be cautious. The gala tonight, too many eyes. Then let us conclude our business elsewhere, the Countess suggested. The usual place, tomorrow at midnight. Ashburn hesitated, then nodded. Very well, but ensure the others are ready. The tiara must be ours before the exhibition. There. Conversation ended abruptly as a new group of guests approached, forcing Ashburn and the Countess to adopt polite smiles and rejoin the festivities. Holmes and Watson retreated, slipping back into the crowd before they could be noticed. Well, Watson asked, his voice low. What do you make of that? Holmes' eyes were alight with the thrill of discovery. Ashburn is not the mastermind, Watson, but a key player. His mention of the syndicate confirms our suspicions. This is no petty theft, but an operation with international stakes. The Countess is likely a liaison, perhaps even the link to the true orchestrator. And this usual place they spoke of, we must find it. Watson nodded, his mind racing. What's our next move? We follow Ashburn, Holmes said decisively. His behavior tonight suggests he is under pressure, perhaps from his co-conspirators. If we can track him to this midnight meeting tomorrow, we may uncover the full scope of the plot. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of observation and subterfuge. Holmes and Watson circulated among the guests, their ears attuned to any hint of further intrigue. Ashburn, for his part, played the perfect host, though his glances toward the Countess betrayed his unease. As the gala drew to a close, Holmes noted the nobleman's departure in a private carriage, accompanied by a man whose face was obscured by a low-brimmed hat. That's our cue, Holmes said, leading Watson to the street, where they hailed a cab of their own. Driver, follow that carriage, but keep your distance. The pursuit took them through the winding streets of London, the fog thickening as they moved eastward. Ashburn's carriage stopped at a nondescript warehouse in Whitechapel, a far cry from the elegance of Mayfair. Holmes signalled their driver to halt a block away, and they disembarked, cloaked in the shadows. Whitechapel, Watson muttered, his hand resting on the revolver in his pocket. Not exactly a nobleman's haunt. Precisely, Holmes said, his voice a whisper. Stay alert, Watson. We are in the lion's den. They crept closer, using the fog as cover. The warehouse loomed dark and silent, its windows boarded, its door slightly ajar. Holmes peered inside, his keen eyes picking out faint movement in the gloom. Voices echoed faintly, Ashburn's tense and clipped, and another, deeper and commanding. The tiara is the key, the unknown voice said. Without it, the syndicate's plans falter. You assured me it would be secured. It will be, Ashburn replied, his tone defensive. But Holmes is closer than we anticipated. If he suspects, Then deal with him, the other voice snapped. Permanently, if necessary. Watson's grip on his revolver tightened, but Holmes placed a restraining hand on his arm. Not yet, he whispered. We need more. They lingered, straining to hear, but the conversation shifted to logistic states, times, a mention of the exhibition and the decoy. Holmes' mind worked furiously, piecing together the fragments. The tiara, it seemed, was not merely a prize but a symbol, a bargaining chip in a larger game of power and influence. As the meeting concluded, Holmes and Watson retreated, their footsteps silent on the damp cobblestones. They returned to Baker Street under the cover of dawn, the city stirring to life around them. In the quiet of their sitting room, Holmes paced, his pipe unlit but clenched between his teeth. Ashburn is a pawn, Watson, he said at last. His fear, his deference to that other voice, suggests a superior, someone pulling the strings. The Countess is likely a go-between, but the true mastermind remains hidden. Tomorrow's meeting will be our chance to unmask them. Watson, nursing a brandy to steady his nerves, nodded. And the tiara? Why is it so important to this syndicate? Holmes paused, his gaze distant. The tiara is more than a jewel. Its theft would be a blow to the crown's prestige, a signal to certain foreign powers that England's defences are vulnerable. The syndicate, I suspect, seeks to destabilize, to profit from chaos. But we shall thwart them, Watson. We must. The day that followed was a whirlwind of preparation. Holmes pored over maps of Whitechapel, cross-referencing them with known criminal haunts. He dispatched telegrams to his network of informants, seeking any mention of the Countess or the mysterious warehouse. Watson, meanwhile, ensured their revolvers were loaded and their disguises, those of common labourers, were ready for the midnight rendezvous. As night fell, they set out, their faces smudged with dirt, their clothes rough and unassuming. The warehouse was as they had left it, its silence deceptive. Holmes and Watson took up positions in an alley across the street, hidden by crates and shadows. The minutes ticked by, each one heavy with anticipation. At precisely midnight, a carriage arrived, disgorging Ashburn and the Countess. They entered the warehouse, followed shortly by the man in the low-brimmed hat. Holmes' eyes narrowed as he recognized the gait. The posturate was no stranger, but someone he had encountered before, though the name eluded him. Inside, the voices resumed, their words clearer now through a cracked window. The man in the hat spoke with authority, outlining a plan to exploit the vault's flaw during the tiara's transfer. Ashburn protested, citing Holmes' interference, but the man dismissed him with a curt gesture. Holmes will be dealt with, he said. Our agent in the palace ensures it. Watson's jaw clenched, but Holmes remained still, his mind racing. An agent in the palace, another piece of the puzzle, confirming the inside job they had suspected. But who and how deep did this conspiracy run? The meeting ended abruptly, the conspirators dispersing into the night. Holmes and Watson followed at a distance, tracking Ashburn's carriage back to Mayfair. They did not confront him, not yet. Holmes preferred to let the web tighten, to gather every thread before striking. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat by the fire, his violin resting on his knee, though he did not play. We are close, Watson, he said, his voice low. The gala, the warehouse, the syndicate, they are all connected. Tomorrow, we must uncover this palace agent and confirm the mastermind's identity. Only then can we prevent the theft. Watson nodded, his resolve firm. And if they try to harm you, Holmes' smile was grim. "Then they shall find that Sherlock Holmes is not so easily dispatched." The night stretched on, the weight of their task settling over them like the fog. Outside, the game was afoot, and the stakes had never been higher. Chapter 7. The Secret of the Locked Vault. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of 2-1B Baker Street, casting a golden hue across the cluttered sitting room. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed on the fire crackling in the grate. The air was thick with the scent of pipe smoke and the faint tank of ink from the papers strewn across the table. I, Dr. John Watson, sat opposite him, nursing a cup of tea and watching my friend's intense concentration with a mixture of curiosity and exasperation. The case of the Queen's tiara had taken a perplexing turn. The cryptic warning, the subtle clues within Buckingham Palace, the mysterious invitation, and the coded message all pointed to a plot of extraordinary cunning. Yet the heart of the mystery remained elusive. Holmes had been silent for nearly an hour, his mind, no doubt, racing through the labyrinth of facts and suppositions we had gathered. I knew better than to interrupt, but the weight of the investigation pressed heavily upon me. "Holmes," I ventured at last, "have you made any sense of that coded message? The Crimson Jewel business, it's all rather cryptic, even for you." He stirred, his sharp grey eyes flicking toward me. "The code, Watson, is a mere trifle compared to the question of access. The tiara resides in a vault within Buckingham Palace, a fortress within a fortress. No ordinary thief could breach it. The key to this mystery lies not in the code, but in the vault itself." I frowned. The vault. Surely it's impregnable. The Queen's treasures are guarded like no other in the realm. Impregnable. Holmes' lips curled into a faint smile. "No such thing exists, my dear Watson. Every lock has its flaw, every fortress its weakness. We must inspect this. Vault ourselves. I have arranged an audience with Sir Reginald Harrow, the Keeper of the Royal Treasury, this afternoon. Finish your tea, Watson. We have work to do." By noon, we were rattling through the streets of London in a hansom cab, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, a familiar rhythm. The city was alive with its usual bustle, vendors hawking their wares, omnibuses weaving through traffic, and the ever-present fog curling around lampposts like a living thing. Holmes, as was his habit, stared out the window, his expression unreadable. I wondered what threads of the case he was weaving together in that remarkable mind of his. We arrived at Buckingham Palace, its grand facade looming through the mist. A liveried footman escorted us through a series of marble corridors, each more opulent than the last, until we reached a small, unassuming door tucked behind a tapestry. Sir Reginald Harrow awaited us there, a wiry man with a pinched face and spectacles perched precariously on his nose. He greeted us with a nervous nod, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice clipped. "I must confess, I find this request most irregular. The vault is secure, I assure you. The very notion of a breach is preposterous." Holmes' eyes gleamed with that peculiar intensity that signalled his mind was already several steps ahead. "Irregular, perhaps, but necessary, Sir Reginald. I do not question your diligence, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Shall we proceed?" Sir Reginald hesitated, then unlocked the door with a heavy iron key. It swung open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A guard, clad in the scarlet uniform of the palace detail, stood at attention, his face impassive. Holmes gave him a cursory glance before following Sir Reginald down the steps, with me close behind. The air grew cooler as we descended, the walls damp with the scent of stone and time. At the bottom, we faced a massive steel door, its surface etched with intricate engravings of the royal crest. Sir Reginald produced another key, this one smaller and more ornate, and inserted it into a lock that seemed to hum with mechanical precision. With a series of clicks and groans, the door swung inward, revealing the vault. It was a cavernous chamber, its walls lined with shelves of gleaming treasures, gold chalices, jeweled scepters, and, at the center, on a velvet pedestal, the Queen's tiara. Its diamonds caught the dim light of the gas lamps, casting prismatic flecks across the stone walls. I caught my breath at the sight, but Holmes' attention was elsewhere. He moved swiftly, his eyes scanning every inch of the room with the precision of a hawk. "Remarkable," he murmured, crouching to examine the floor. "Watson, observe the dust here. It is undisturbed, save for a faint scuff near the pedestal." And there he pointed to a corner where a small grate was embedded in the wall. That ventilation shaft, far too narrow for a man, but perhaps not for a tool or device. Sir Reginald sputtered. "A device? Mr. Holmes, this vault is inspected daily. The locks are triple reinforced, the walls solid granite. No one could enter without my knowledge." Holmes straightened, his expression unyielding. "Yet someone has, Sir Reginald. The scuff mark suggests recent activity, and the great tell. Me, when was it last inspected?" The keeper's face paled. I cannot say with certainty. The guards checked the main entry points, but the ventilation system. Holmes' gaze sharpened. "A flaw then, a small one, but sufficient for a mind as cunning as our adversaries. Watson, note the angle of the grate's screws. They are slightly misaligned, as if recently removed and replaced." I scribbled in my notebook, my heart quickening. "You think someone tampered with it?" "I think," Holmes said, "that our thief has already tested the vault's defenses. The tiara remains, but only because the time for the theft has not yet arrived. Sir Reginald, I require a detailed schematic of the palace's ventilation system and a list of all personnel with access to this vault." Sir Reginald nodded, his earlier skepticism replaced by unease. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. I shall have them prepared at once." We returned to Baker Street that evening, the and personnel list tucked safely in Holmes' coat. The sitting room was a chaos of papers as he spread the documents across the table, his pipe sending curls of smoke toward the ceiling. I watched as he traced the ventilation system's labyrinthine paths with a pencil, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The vault's flaw is subtle but exploitable," he said at last. "The ventilation shaft connects to a maintenance tunnel that emerges in an unused wing of the palace. It is narrow, but a skilled operative, perhaps with a mechanical device, could navigate it. The question is, who knew of this weakness?" Glanced at the personnel list. There are dozens of names here. Homes, guards, clerks, even members of the royal household. How do we narrow it down? Holmes tapped the schematic. We begin with opportunity. The maintenance tunnel is accessible only to those with specific clearance. Cross-reference the list with anyone who has worked in the palace's engineering or custodial staff within the past year. I set to work, poring over the names while Holmes continued his study of the schematics. Hours passed, the fire dying to embers, until I found a name that stood out. "Holmes, look at this Thomas Grimsby." a maintenance worker dismissed 3 months ago for irregular conduct. His file notes he was caught lingering near restricted areas. Holmes' eyes lit up. Grimsby, an interesting lead. Irregular conduct could be a euphemism for espionage or reconnaissance. We must find this man, Watson. He may hold the key to the vault's secret. The next morning, we ventured into the labyrinth of London's East End, where Grimsby was rumoured to reside. The streets were a stark contrast to the grandeur of Buckingham. Palace narrow, grimy, and teeming with life. Holmes, disguised as a labourer in a worn cap and coat, moved with the ease of a man accustomed to blending into any crowd. I followed, my revolver tucked discreetly in my pocket, my nerves on edge. Grimsby's lodgings were in a dilapidated tenement, its walls stained with soot. Holmes knocked sharply, and a gaunt man with a scarred face answered, his eyes narrowing at the sight of us. "Thomas Grimsby," Holmes asked, his voice low but commanding. "Who's asking?" the man growled. Holmes smiled thinly. "A friend with an interest in locks and vaults. May we speak?" Grimsby hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing us into a cramped room that smelled of damp and tobacco. He sat heavily on a rickety chair, his hands fidgeting. "What do you want? I ain't done nothing." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You worked at Buckingham Palace. You know the vault's ventilation system. Tell me, Mr. Grimsby, who paid you to map its weaknesses?" Grimsby's face drained of colour. "I don't know what you're talking about, do you not?" Holmes produced a small tool from his Paquita miniature screwdriver, its tip worn from use. "This was found near the vault's grate. It matches the type used by palace maintenance workers. Shall I assume it's yours?" Grimsby's hands trembled. I was approached, all right. A man offered me £50 to sketch the tunnels. Said it was for a private collector, nothing more. I needed the money. Holmes' voice was cold. The man's name, Grimsby. I don't know, he never gave it. Tall, dark hair, foreign accent, maybe German. Met me in a pub near the docks. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. A foreign accent aligned with the international syndicate hinted at in the Crimson Jewel Code. "Describe him," Holmes pressed. Grimsby complied, his words tumbling out in a rush. The man was tall, impeccably dressed, with a scar above his left eyebrow and a habit of tapping his cane. Holmes listened intently, committing every detail to memory. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Grimsby," Holmes said, rising. "A word of advice, leave London for a time. Those you've dealt with are not forgiving." Over the next 2 days, Holmes and I worked tirelessly. He corresponded with Inspector Lestrade, arranging for discreet surveillance of the palace's maintenance tunnels. I interviewed additional palace staff, searching for any connection to Grimsby's mysterious contact. Meanwhile, Holmes devised a plan to reinforce the vault's security without alerting the conspirators. On the 3rd day, we returned to the palace, accompanied by Lestrade and a small team of trusted officers. Sir Reginald, now fully cooperative, led us back to the vault. Holmes inspected the grate again, this time with a magnifying glass, and discovered a faint residue of oil, evidence of a recent intrusion. "They've been here again," Holmes said, his voice low. "The heist is imminent." Lestrade frowned. "But the tiara is still there. Why haven't they taken it?" Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Because they're waiting for the exhibition. The tiara will be moved, exposed, vulnerable. That's when they'll strike. We must prepare a trap." That night, Holmes and I took up positions in the maintenance tunnel, concealed behind a stack of crates. The air was stifling, the darkness absolute save for the faint glow of our lantern. Holmes was a shadow beside me, his breathing steady, his senses attuned to the slightest sound. I gripped my revolver, my heart pounding. Hours passed in silence. Then a faint scrape echoed through the tunnel. Holmes tensed, his hand on my arm. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with the stealth of a cat. He carried a small satchel, and in the dim light I caught a glimpse of a scar above his eyebrow. Holmes sprang forward, his voice sharp. "Halt! You are under arrest." The man spun, drawing a pistol, but Holmes was faster. With a swift motion, he knocked the weapon from the man's hand, pinning him against the wall. Lestrade and his men rushed in, securing the intruder. The man sneered, his accent unmistakably German. "You're too late, Holmes. The plan is in motion." Holmes' smile was cold. "We shall see." The prisoner was taken to Scotland Yard, but Holmes was far from satisfied. "He's a pawn, Watson," he said as we returned to Baker Street. "The mastermind remains at large. The vault's secret is exposed, but the true danger lies ahead." I sank into my chair, exhausted but exhilarated. "What now, Holmes?" He lit his pipe, his eyes gleaming with determination. "Now we prepare for the exhibition. The game is afoot, Watson, and we must be ready for its final move." The case was far from over, but the secret of the locked vault had brought us one step closer to unraveling the plot. As the fire crackled, I felt the weight of the challenge ahead, and the unshakable certainty that, with Sherlock Holmes leading the way, we would prevail. Chapter 8. The traitor among the guards. The rain had begun to fall in earnest over London. A steady drizzle that turned the cobblestones slick and mirrored the gaslights in shimmering pools. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson sat in their lodgings. At 221B Baker Street, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and the faint taint of damp wool from Watson's overcoat, still drying by the door. Holmes, perched in his armchair, held a folded letter between his fingers, his sharp eyes scanning its contents for the third time that evening. "It's a matter of trust, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low, almost drowned by the patter of rain against the window. "The palace guards are the Queen's first line of defense, yet one among them is a serpent in the grass. This letter confirms it." Watson, seated across from him, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "A traitor among the guards. That's a bold claim, Holmes. What proof have we?" Holmes flicked the letter onto the table, where it landed beside a half-empty teacup. "This missive, delivered to me this morning by a street urchin, is written in a cipher I recognized at once a variation of the Vigenère, used by a certain criminal syndicate I've encountered before. It speaks of a guard, one who knows the vault's inner workings, who has been feeding information to our elusive conspirators." Watson picked up the letter, squinting at the jumble of letters scrawled in black ink. "And you've deciphered it already, I presume?" Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. Naturally, the key word was Tiara, a touch of irony from our adversaries. "The message names no names, but describes a guard who was served for less than a year, with a penchant for gambling and a habit of lingering near the vault during his rounds. It's a start, Watson, but we need more." The doctor set the letter down, his expression grim. Gambling debts could make a man desperate enough to betray his post. But how do we find this traitor among dozens of guards? Holmes rose, his lean frame unfolding with purpose. "We go to the source. Tomorrow we return to Buckingham Palace. You, Watson, will observe the guards' every glance, every hesitation. I shall inspect their records and routines. A traitor, however careful, leaves traces. By morning, the rain had cleared, leaving a crisp chill in the air. The two men arrived at Buckingham Palace under the guise of consultants reviewing security, measures for the Tiara's upcoming exhibition. The palace buzzed with activity servants, polished silver, maids bustled with linens, and guards stood rigid at their posts, their scarlet uniforms pristine under the autumn sun. Holmes, dressed in a severe black suit, moved with the precision of a hawk, his eyes darting from face to face. Watson, ever the soldier, carried himself with an air of quiet authority, his gaze steady as he memorized the guard's movements. The captain of the guard, a stout man named Hargreaves, met them in a wood-panelled office overlooking the palace courtyard. His mustache twitched as he spoke, his tone clipped. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I assure you, my men are beyond reproach. Each one is vetted thoroughly. A traitor, preposterous." Holmes steepled his fingers, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Captain, loyalty is not a static quality. A man may be honorable today and compromised tomorrow. I require access to your personnel, record states of service, backgrounds, and any reported indiscretions." Hargreaves bristled but relented, under the weight of Holmes' unyielding stare. "Very well, but you'll find nothing amiss." The records room was a cramped chamber beneath the palace, its air heavy with the musty scent of old paper. Shelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound ledgers, each detailing the lives of the palace's staff. Holmes pored over the files, his fingers moving with the dexterity of a pianist, while Watson stood by the door, keeping an eye on the corridor. The guards' records revealed little at first. Most were career soldiers, their lives a predictable tapestry of duty and discipline. But one file caught Holmes' attention. Corporal Edmund Vance, aged 28, enlisted 10 months prior. His record noted a reprimand for tardiness, attributed to personal matters, and a vague reference to debts settled by an unnamed benefactor. Vance, Holmes murmured, tapping the page. "A recent addition, and one with financial troubles. Promising." Watson glanced over. "Do you think he's our man?" "Not yet, Watson. Suspicion is not evidence, but he merits closer scrutiny." Their next stop was the barracks, where the guards were preparing for the evening shift. Holmes moved among them, asking innocuous questions about their routines, his eyes noting every detail, the way one man fidgeted with his cuff, another avoided eye contact. Vance, a lanky figure, with a boyish face and nervous hands, stood out. He lingered near the edge of the group, his eyes darting toward the door as if expecting an escape. Watson, playing his part, struck up a conversation with Vance under the pretense of discussing military life. "You've not been here long, have you, Corporal?" Watson asked, his tone genial. "Must be quite a change from the regular army." Vance's smile was tight. "Aye, sir, it's an honor, but the hours are long. Keeps a man busy." "Busy enough to keep you out of the card rooms, I hope," Watson said lightly, watching for a reaction. Vance's face paled, his fingers twitching. "I don't gamble much, sir, not anymore." Holmes, observing from a distance, noted the lie. Vance's hands betrayed him clenching, unclenching, a telltale sign of guilt. But a gambling habit alone did not make a traitor. They needed more. That evening, Holmes devised a plan. "We must test Vance's loyalties, Watson. If he is our traitor, he will act when pressured. I shall arrange for a rumor to False report that the Tiara's security has been tightened with new locks installed on the vault. If Vance is compromised, he will relay this to his handlers. Watson frowned. And how do we catch him in the act? Holmes' eyes gleamed. We watch. Tonight, you and I will shadow him. If he makes contact with the syndicate, we'll have our proof. Under the cover of darkness, Holmes and Watson took up positions outside the palace, hidden in the shadows of a nearby alley. The fog had returned, cloaking London in a ghostly veil. Vance emerged from the barracks at 11:30, his movements furtive. He glanced over his shoulder, then slipped into the maze of streets, heading toward the East End. Holmes and Watson followed, their footsteps muffled by the fog. Vance's path led to a dingy pub, its windows glowing faintly through the mist. He entered, and Holmes motioned for Watson to wait. Slipping inside, Holmes donned a cap and scarf, blending into the crowd of labourers and dock workers. Vance sat at a corner table, speaking in low tones to a man with a scarred face and a heavy coat. Holmes, seated nearby, strained to catch their words. The locks are new, Vance whispered. They've doubled the guard. It's riskier now. The scarred man leaned closer. You're sure our buyer won't wait? The exhibition's in 3 days. Holmes' pulse quickened. This was the confirmation he needed. Vance was indeed the traitor, feeding information to the syndicate. But who was this scarred man, and who was the buyer? Holmes memorized the man's features, noting the crooked nose, the missing earlobe, the faint accent Eastern European, perhaps. As Vance rose to leave, Holmes slipped out, rejoining Watson. In the alley, we have our traitor, he said quietly. But the net is wider than I feared. This syndicate has deep roots, and Vance is but a pawn. Watson's jaw tightened. What now, Holmes? Confront him. Not yet. We let him believe he's undetected. Tomorrow we follow the scarred man. He will lead us to the heart of the conspiracy. The next day dawned grey and cold, the city still wrapped in fog. Holmes and Watson returned to the palace, where Holmes requested a private meeting with Captain Hargreaves. In the captain's office, Holmes laid out the evidence. Vance's gambling debts, his nervous demeanour, and the overheard conversation. Hargreaves' face reddened, his fists clenching. I'll have him arrested at once, the captain growled. Holmes raised a hand. No, Captain. Arrest him now, and we lose the chance to catch his masters. Let him continue his duties, but watch him closely. I will handle the rest. Hargreaves nodded reluctantly. His pride stung, but his trust in Holmes absolute. Meanwhile, Watson took it upon himself to investigate the guards' routines further, hoping to uncover any accomplices. He spent the day observing their interactions, noting how Vance avoided certain colleagues while exchanging brief, coded gestures with others. By evening, Watson had identified 2 other guards who seemed unusually close to Vance: a burly sergeant named Collins and a wiry private named Harrow. Both had joined the palace staff within the past year, and both, Watson discovered, frequented the same gambling dens as Vance. Holmes, meanwhile, tracked the scarred man to a warehouse in Whitechapel, a decrepit building that smelled of tar and decay. Disguised as a dock worker, Holmes infiltrated the area, overhearing fragments of conversation about the shipment and the buyer's impatience. The scarred man, whom Holmes identified as a known smuggler named Karol Vronsky, was clearly a key figure in the syndicate. But the mastermind remained elusive. That night, Holmes and Watson reconvened at Baker Street, piecing together their findings. Vance is our weak link, Holmes said, pacing before the fire. But Collins and Harrow may also be involved. We must assume the syndicate has multiple operatives within the palace. The Tiara's exhibition is their deadline 3 days hence. We have little time. Watson rubbed his chin. What's their end game, Holmes? The tiara's valuable, but is it worth this risk? Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing. The tiara is more than a jewel. The ciphered message suggested it holds a secret, perhaps, a diplomatic one. Its theft could destabilize alliances, embarrass the crown, or worse. We must uncover the buyer's identity. The following morning, Holmes devised a new strategy. He instructed Hargreaves to stage a drill simulating a breach in the vault's security. The guards, including Vance, Collins, and Harrow, were summoned to respond. Holmes and Watson watched from a concealed vantage point, noting how Vance hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Collins. Harrow, meanwhile, moved too quickly, as if eager to prove his loyalty. During the drill, Holmes slipped into the guards' locker room, searching their belongings. In Vance's locker, he found a scrap of paper with a hastily scrawled address: a boarding house in Limehouse. In Collins' kit, a hidden compartment held a small vial of an unknown substance, possibly a sedative. Harrow's possessions yielded nothing, but his locker bore fresh scratches, as if recently forced open. Holmes shared his findings with Watson as they left the palace. The address in Limehouse is our next lead, he said, but the vial troubles me. If they plan to drug the guards during the heist, we're dealing with a meticulous operation. The Limehouse boarding house was a squalid affair, its halls reeking of cabbage and stale beer. Posing as a debt collector, Holmes gained entry and questioned the landlady, who confirmed that a man matching Vronsky's description visited regularly, always meeting a young soldier in private. The room in question was empty, but Holmes' keen eyes spotted a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a bundle of letters, written in the same cipher as before. They detailed payments to Vance and instructions for the heist, including a map of the vault's blind spots. Watson, stationed outside, kept watch for Vronsky or his associates. As dusk fell, a figure approached Harrow. Not Vance. The private entered the boarding house, unaware of Watson's presence. Holmes, still inside, overheard Harrow's conversation with the landlady, confirming that Harrow was indeed part of the syndicate, acting as a courier between Vance and Vronsky. Holmes and Watson regrouped in a nearby tavern, their minds racing. Harrow and Vance are in league, Holmes said, sketching a diagram of the palace vault on a napkin. Collins. Maybe they're muscle, or he could be unaware of the full plot. The vial suggests they plan to incapacitate the night shift during the heist. Watson nodded. And the exhibition is tomorrow night. We're running out of time. Holmes' eyes gleamed with determination. Then we act tonight. We'll confront Vance, but not before we plant false information. If he believes the tiara has been moved to a secondary vault, he'll tip his hand and lead us to Vronsky's superiors. Under the cover of night, Holmes arranged for a forged memo to reach Vance, claiming the tiara had been relocated to a secure room in the palace's West Wing. Watson, stationed near Vance's post, observed the corporal's reaction: a flurry of whispered exchanges with Harrow, followed by a hasty departure. Holmes, disguised as a palace servant, followed, with Watson close behind. The trail led to a derelict stable in Stweck, where Vronsky waited with 2 other men, one a wiry figure in a top hat, the other a hulking brute with a scarred hand. Holmes, hidden in the shadows, overheard their plan. The heist was set for the gala, when the tiara would be displayed publicly. Vance's role was to disable the vault's alarm, while Harrow and Collins distracted the guards. The buyer referred to only as the Count would receive the tiara in Paris within days. Holmes signalled Watson to retreat. Back at Baker Street, they planned their next move. The Count, Holmes mused, staring into the fire. A title, not a name. He's the key to this syndicate, and I suspect he's someone I've crossed before. Watson gripped his revolver. What's our play, Holmes? We let the heist proceed, Holmes said, his voice steady, but we control the board. Tomorrow, at the gala, we'll have Hargreaves' men ready, and I'll ensure the tiara is never at risk. Vance, Harrow, and Collins will expose themselves, and will follow the trail to the Count. As the fire died down, Holmes lit his pipe, the smoke curling upward like the threads of the conspiracy he was unraveling. The traitor among the guards had been found, but the true battle lay ahead at the gala, where the fate of the Queen's tiara, and perhaps the crown itself, would be decided. Chapter 9. The midnight rendezvous. The fog had thickened over London, draping the city in a shroud of grey that muffled sound and blurred the edges of reality. Gas lamps flickered like weary sentinels, their light barely piercing the haze that clung to the cobblestones. Sherlock Holmes stood motionless in the shadow of a derelict warehouse in St. James's, his sharp eyes fixed on the narrow alley across the street. His greatcoat, damp from the mist, blended seamlessly with the gloom, rendering him nearly invisible. Beside him, Dr. John Watson shifted uneasily, his hand resting on the revolver tucked inside his coat pocket. The air was heavy with the scent of coal smoke and the faint Thames carried on a sluggish breeze. Holmes, Watson whispered, his voice barely audible, "Are you certain this is the place? It's been nearly an hour, and we've seen nothing but rats." Holmes' lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, though his gaze never wavered. "Patience, Watson. The criminal mind is punctual when it believes itself unobserved. Our quarry will come." The cryptic message Holmes had deciphered in the previous days, the code of the Crimson Jewel, had pointed to this moment. The coded missive, hidden within a seemingly innocuous advertisement in the Times, had revealed not only the significance of the Queen's tiara to an international syndicate, but also the time and place of a clandestine meeting. Tonight, at the stroke of midnight, in this forgotten corner of St. James's, the conspirators would gather to finalize their plans for the heist. Holmes had been adamant. They must observe, not interfere, not yet. The trap would come later, when the conspirators' guard was lowest. The church bells of St. Martin in the Fields tolled midnight, their sombre notes reverberating through the fog. Watson tensed, his breath catching as a faint shuffle echoed from the alley. Holmes raised a hand, signalling silence. From the shadows emerged two figures, their silhouettes distorted by the mist. One was tall and lean, moving with a predatory grace, while the other was shorter, broader, with a heavy gait that suggested brute strength. They paused at the mouth of the alley, glancing about as if sensing unseen eyes. Holmes leaned closer to Watson, his voice a mere breath. "Note the taller one's posture military, likely an ex-officer. The other carries himself like a dock worker, but his boots are too fine for such a trade. Interesting." Watson squinted, straining to make out details in the dim light. "You can see their boots in this fog. I observe, Watson, the way a man walks reveals more than his face." The two figures exchanged low words, their voices too soft to carry. Holmes edged forward, his movements silent as a cat's. Watson followed, his heart pounding. They crept along the warehouse wall, using the shadows as cover, until they were close enough to catch fragments of the conversation. "The vault's floor is confirmed," the taller man said, his voice clipped and precise. "The guard rotation leaves a 5-minute window at 3 in the morning. We strike then," the shorter man grunted. "And the tiara, you're sure it's still in the palace?" "Certain. Our man inside saw it yesterday. The exhibition transfer is tomorrow evening. We take it before it moves." Watson's grip tightened on his revolver. The audacity of the plant to steal the Queen's tiara from Buckingham Palace itself was staggering. Holmes, however, remained impassive, his eyes gleaming with the intensity of a predator closing in on its prey. He gestured for Watson to stay low as a third figure joined the group, this one cloaked and hooded, moving with an almost ghostly silence. "Who's that?" Watson mouthed, but Holmes shook his head, his focus absolute. The newcomer spoke, their voice low and deliberately muffled, as if to conceal their identity. "The mastermind grows impatient. The syndicate expects delivery by week's end. Fail, and we all pay the price." The taller man nodded. "We won't fail. The decoy is in place, and the guard's betrayal is secured. By tomorrow night, the tiara will be ours." The hooded figure turned, as if sensing something, and for a moment their gaze seemed to pierce the fog directly toward Holmes and Watson. Watson froze, his breath held, but Holmes remained still as stone. After a tense pause, the figure turned back, and the trio resumed their hushed discussion. Holmes tapped Watson's arm, signaling a retreat. They slipped back along the warehouse wall, moving with painstaking care to avoid detection. Once they were a safe distance away, Holmes spoke, his voice low but urgent. "This is worse than I feared, Watson. The syndicate's reach extends further than I anticipated. That hooded figure, they are the key." Their voice, though disguised, carried an accent I cannot yet place. Possibly Eastern European, but I need more data. Watson frowned, wiping the damp from his brow. "And the guard's betrayal? We suspected as much, but to hear it confirmed." "Yes," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing. "The traitor among the palace guards is no mere pawn. They have access to the vault's inner workings, which suggests a position of trust. We must identify them before the heist unfolds." They made their way back through the fog-shrouded streets. Holmes lost in thought, his mind racing through the permutations of the plot. Watson, though accustomed to his friend's silences, could not shake a growing unease. "Holmes, if they're this organized, what's to stop them from succeeding? The tiara's transfer to the exhibition tomorrow evening, it's the perfect opportunity." Holmes stopped abruptly, his silhouette sharp against the glow of a nearby gas lamp. "Precisely, Watson. That is why we must act swiftly. Tomorrow we return to the palace. I have a theory about the vault's floor, but I must inspect it again to confirm, and we must keep a close eye on the guards, particularly those with access to the tiara." The next morning, the fog had lifted, but a grey pallor lingered over London, as if the city itself sensed the impending crime. Holmes and Watson arrived at Buckingham Palace under the pretense of a follow-up inspection, their credentials from the Home Office granting them access. The palace was a hive of activity, servants bustling to prepare for the tiara's transfer to the public exhibition at the Royal Academy. The Queen's tiara, a dazzling creation of diamonds and sapphires, was to be the centerpiece of a diplomatic showcase, symbolizing the crown's enduring prestige. Its theft would be a blow not only to the monarchy but to Britain's standing. On the world stage, in the vault room, Holmes moved with purpose, his magnifying glass in hand as he examined the massive steel door and its intricate locking mechanism. Watson stood by, watching the guards stationed nearby. Their faces were stoic, but one, a young man with a scar above his left eyebrows, seemed to avoid Holmes' gaze, his posture tense. "The floor is here," Holmes murmured, pointing to a series of bolts along the vault's inner frame. "The design is ingenious, but the bolts are misaligned by a fraction of an inch. A skilled engineer could exploit this with the right tools, forcing the door without triggering the alarms." Watson's eyes widened. "And someone inside would know this precisely. The traitor must have intimate knowledge of the vault's construction, likely someone involved in its maintenance or installation." As they left the vault, Holmes paused to speak with the head of security, Captain Hargrove, a grizzled veteran with a reputation for loyalty. "Captain, have any of your men reported unusual activity around the vault in recent weeks?" Hargrove frowned, his mustache twitching. "None, Mr. Holmes. My men are hand-picked, loyal to the crown. I'd stake my life on it." "Even the best men can be swayed," Holmes said, his tone neutral. "I suggest you double the guard tonight and vary their rotations. Predictability is the thief's greatest ally." Hargrove nodded, though his expression betrayed skepticism. As they departed, Watson whispered, "That scarred guard, did you notice how he reacted when you mentioned the vault?" "I did," Holmes replied. "Corporal Edmund Blake. Recently promoted with a spotless record. Too spotless, perhaps. We shall keep an eye on him." That evening, as the city prepared for the gala at the Royal Academy, Holmes and Watson returned to St. James's. Holmes had devised a plan. They would stake out the alley again, hoping to catch the conspirators in the act of finalizing their preparations. The fog had returned, thicker than the previous night, and the streets were eerily quiet. They took up position in a different vantage point, this time atop a low rooftop overlooking the alley. Holmes had brought a small listening device of his own design, a delicate contraption of brass and glass that amplified sound. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into eternity. Watson's nerves were taut, his mind replaying the overheard conversation from the previous night. The syndicate's reach, the traitor in the palace. The hooded figure was a web of intrigue that seemed to tighten with every revelation. At last movement. The same two figures from the previous night appeared, joined shortly by the hooded stranger. Holmes adjusted the listening device, and their voices came through with startling clarity. "The decoy is set," the tall man said. "The exhibition will draw the crowds, and the palace will be vulnerable. Blake has confirmed the window." The hooded figure nodded. "Good. The mastermind has arranged for a distraction at the gala. When the chaos begins, you strike. The tiara must be in our hands by dawn." Watson's blood ran cold. "Holmes," he whispered, "they're moving tonight." Holmes' eyes gleamed with a fierce intensity. "Indeed, Watson. The game is afoot. We must return to the palace at once. If Blake is the traitor, he will be at the vault tonight, preparing the way." They descended from the rooftop and hurried through the fog, their footsteps muffled but urgent. The palace loomed ahead, its windows glowing like beacons in the night. Holmes' mind was a whirlwind of calculations, piecing together the final threads of the conspiracy. The traitor, the vault's floor, the syndicate's planet all converged on this moment at the palace. They found Captain Hargrove and relayed their suspicions about Corporal Blake. Hargrove's face darkened, but he wasted no time ordering a search of Blake's quarters. Within minutes, a guard returned with a damning discovery: a set of tools designed to exploit the vault's misaligned bolts, hidden beneath Blake's bunk. "He's fled," Hargrove growled. "He was on duty an hour ago, but hasn't been seen since." Holmes' expression was grim. "Then he's already inside, preparing the way. Watson, Hargrove, with me. We must secure the vault now." They raced to the vault room, their footsteps echoing through the palace's marble corridors. The vault door stood ajar, a faint light spilling from within. Holmes drew his revolver, motioning for Watson and Hargrove to do the same. They entered cautiously, the air thick with tension. Inside, Corporal Blake stood at the vault's inner chamber, his hands working feverishly at the bolts. He froze as Holmes' voice cut through the silence. "Step away, Blake. You're part in. This is over." Blake spun, his face pale but defiant. "You're too late, Holmes. The syndicate will have the tiara, and there's nothing you can do." Holmes advanced, his revolver steady. "You underestimate me, Corporal. The tiara remains, and your accomplices will soon join you in custody." Blake lunged, a knife glinting in his hand, but Watson was faster, tackling him to the ground. Hargrove secured the traitor with handcuffs, his face a mask of fury. The vault, mercifully, remained intact, the tiara still secure within its case, as Blake was led away. Holmes examined the vault once more, his mind already racing ahead to the gala. "The syndicate's distraction is still in play," he said. "We must get to the Royal Academy before they realize their plan has failed." Watson nodded, his heart still pounding from the confrontation, and the hooded figure, the mastermind, Holmes. Eyes narrowed. "They are still out there, Watson. But tonight we have struck a blow. The tiara is safe for now." The night was far from over, and the game, as Holmes had said, was afoot. Chapter 10. The Trap in the East End. The fog hung low over London's East End, a thick, choking veil that blurred the gaslights into hazy orbs of yellow. Sherlock Holmes stood motionless in the shadow of a crumbling tenement, his sharp eyes scanning the narrow alleyway ahead. The air was heavy with the stench of coal, smoke, and refuse, and the distant clatter of a hansom cab echoed faintly through the labyrinth of streets. Beside him, Dr. John Watson shifted uneasily, his hand resting on the revolver in his coat pocket. The night was alive with the promise of danger, and Holmes planned a daring trap to ensnare the conspirators. Plotting to steal the Queen's tiara was about to unfold. Holmes had devised the scheme with his usual precision. The cryptic revelations from the midnight rendezvous, overheard 2 nights prior, had confirmed the heist was imminent. The conspirators, led by a shadowy figure whose identity remained elusive, planned to strike during the tiara's transfer to a public exhibition at the Crystal Palace. Holmes had deduced that the East End, with its warren of alleys and disreputable haunts, was the likely staging ground for their final preparations. To lure them out, he had spread a carefully crafted rumor through his network of informants. A disgruntled palace guard, supposedly sympathetic to their cause, was willing to sell critical details about the tiara's transport. The bait was set, and the meeting was arranged for tonight in a derelict warehouse off Cable Street. "Do you think they'll take the bait, Holmes?" Watson whispered, his breath visible in the chill air. Holmes' lips twitched into a faint smile. "They cannot afford not to. Greed and desperation are powerful motivators, Watson. The promise of insider knowledge will draw them like moths to a flame." Watson nodded, though his brow furrowed with concern. and if they suspect a trap, then we shall have to be swifter and sharper than they, Holmes replied, his voice low but resolute. Keep your wits about you, old friend. The game is afoot. The warehouse loomed ahead, its sagging roof and broken windows barely discernible through the fog. Holmes had chosen the location deliberately, place where the conspirators would feel secure, yet one that offered him multiple vantage points. For observation, he had enlisted the aid of Wiggins, the scrappy leader of his Baker Street irregulars, to keep watch on the surrounding streets. The boy's signaller single whistle would alert them to the conspirators' approach. Minutes ticked by, the silence broken only by the occasional drip of water from a rusted gutter. Then a sharp whistle pierced the night. Holmes' posture stiffened, his senses attuned to every sound. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed from the alley's mouth. Two figures emerged from the fog, their silhouettes distorted by the swirling mist. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a low-brimmed hat. The other was slighter, moving with a nervous energy that suggested he was out of his depth. Holmes leaned toward Watson, his voice a mere breath. The tall one is likely our man from the rendezvous. The other, an underling, perhaps. Stay close, but do not act until I give the signal. The figures approached the warehouse door, pausing to glance around, satisfied they were unobserved. They slipped inside. Holmes waited a beat, then motioned for Watson to follow. They crossed the alley swiftly, their footsteps muffled by the damp cobblestones. Holmes pressed his ear to the door, listening for voices within. A low murmur reached him, indistinct but urgent. He pushed the door open just enough to slip through, Watson close behind. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of shadows. Crates and barrels were stacked haphazardly, their contents long since looted or rotted away. A single lantern hung from a beam, casting a feeble glow over the two men. The tall one stood with his back to Holmes, speaking in a gruff voice to his companion, who clutched a satchel with trembling hands. The guard's information better be worth the coin, the tall man was saying. If this is a trick, I'll have his head. It's no trick, the smaller man replied, his voice high with anxiety. He says the Tiara's being moved tomorrow night, through the south gate. 2 carriages, light escort. We can hit them before they reach the Strand. Holmes' eyes gleamed with satisfaction. The trap was working. He had planted the false information through a trusted intermediary, knowing it would reach the conspirators' ears. Now they were revealing their hand. He edged closer, careful to avoid the creaking floorboards, and signaled Watson to take position behind a stack of crates. The tall man turned slightly, his profile catching the lantern's light. Holmes noted the sharp jawline and the scar running. From his ear to his chin a detail he filed away for later. And the buyer, the tall man asked, is he still in play? The smaller man nodded vigorously. He's waiting in Rotterdam. Says he'll pay double if we deliver by week's end. Holmes' mind raced. Rotterdam suggested an international connection, likely the syndicate he had uncovered through the Crimson Jewels Code. The Tiara's theft was not merely a crime of greed, but a move in a larger game, one with stakes far beyond London's borders. He needed to hear more, but time was short. The conspirators would expect their supposed informant, the disgruntled guard, to arrive soon. Holmes had arranged for Wiggins to play the part, disguised as a rough-looking mercenary. The boy's street smarts and quick tongue made him ideal for the role, but Holmes knew the danger. If the conspirators grew suspicious, Wiggins would be at their mercy. Holmes glanced at Watson, who met his gaze with a nod of understanding. They had to act swiftly. The warehouse door creaked open, and Wiggins stepped inside, his cap pulled low over his eyes. He carried himself with a practiced swagger, his voice roughened to match his disguise. "You, the ones looking for a deal," he called out, his tone brash. The tall man turned, sizing Wiggins up. "You're late. Got the details." Wiggins grinned, revealing a gap-toothed smile. "Got 'em right air." He patted his coat pocket. "But I ain't talkin' till I see the coin." The smaller man fidgeted, glancing at his companion. The tall man's eyes narrowed, but he reached into his coat and produced a small pouch, tossing it at Wiggins' feet. "Talk." Wiggins crouched to pick up the pouch, his movements deliberate. Holmes watched, his muscles tensed, ready to intervene. Wiggins opened the pouch, pretending to inspect its contents, then straightened. "Southgate, tomorrow night. 2 carriages, one's a decoy. Tiara's in the second, guarded by 4 men, not 6, like they're saying. Easy pickings, if you're quick." The tall man grunted, seemingly satisfied. "And the vault? Any changes?" Wiggins hesitated, just a fraction too long. Holmes cursed inwardly. The boy was sharp, but he was no actor. The tall man's posture shifted, his hand moving toward his belt. "You're no guard," he growled. "Who sent you?" Before Wiggins could respond, the smaller man lunged, drawing a knife. Watson reacted instantly, stepping from behind the crates with his revolver raised. "Drop it," he barked. The warehouse erupted into chaos. The tall man drew a pistol, firing wildly as he dove behind a stack of barrels. The smaller man slashed at Wiggins, who dodged with surprising agility, scrambling toward the door. Holmes sprang forward, his cane raised like a club, and struck the smaller man's wrist, sending the knife clattering to the floor. Watson covered the door. Holmes shouted, tackling the smaller man to the ground. The man struggled, but Holmes pinned him with a knee to his chest. Twisting his arm to keep him still, Watson fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the sound reverberating through the warehouse. The tall man hesitated, his pistol still raised, but Holmes' voice cut through the din. "Surrender, or my associate will not miss again." For a moment, the tall man seemed to weigh his options. Then, with a snarl, he bolted toward a side exit, disappearing into the shadows. Holmes cursed under his breath, but kept his focus on the man beneath him. "Who's your master?" he demanded, tightening his grip. "Speak, or I'll ensure you never see daylight again." The man spat, his eyes wild with fear. "You'll get nothing from me, Holmes." Holmes' blood ran cold. The man knew his name. This was no ordinary thief. The conspiracy ran deeper than he had feared. Before he could press further, a shout from Watson drew his attention. "Holmes, Wiggins." Holmes glanced toward the door, where Wiggins was slumped against the frame, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his fingers. The smaller man had landed a blow before Holmes intervened. Watson rushed to the boy's side, tearing off his scarf to staunch the wound. "Hold on, lad," Watson said, his voice steady despite the urgency. "We'll get you patched up." Holmes dragged the smaller man to his feet, binding his wrists with a length of cord from his pocket. "You'll talk, one way or another," he said coldly, shoving the man toward Watson. "Secure him. We need to get Wiggins to safety." The fog seemed thicker as they emerged from the warehouse, Wiggins leaning heavily on Watson. Holmes scanned the alley, wary of the tall man's escape. The trap had yielded one prisoner, but the cost was high. Wiggins' injury was a stark reminder of the stakes, and the mention of Holmes' name suggested the conspirators were one step ahead. They moved quickly, navigating the twisting streets until they reached a small, discreet surgery run by a doctor indebted to Holmes. The man worked swiftly, cleaning and stitching Wiggins' wound, while Holmes interrogated their prisoner in a back room. The man remained defiant, offering only taunts and vague threats. "You think you've won," he sneered. "The Tiara. Just the beginning. You can't stop what's coming." Holmes' mind churned. The prisoner's words confirmed the syndicate's broader ambitions. But without the tall man, the likely leader of this cell, they were no closer to the mastermind. He needed more time, more clues, but the Tiara's transfer was less than 24 hours away. The trap had backfired, and now Watson and Wiggins were paying the price, as dawn broke, painting the sky a dull grey. Holmes stood outside the surgery, lighting his pipe. Watson joined him, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Wiggins will pull through," he said. "But that was too close, Holmes. What now?" Holmes exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes distant. "We adapt, Watson. The prisoner will talk, given time. And the tall man's escape is not a loss, but an opportunity. He'll lead us to his master, whether he knows it or not." Watson frowned, and the Tiara Holmes' gaze hardened. "We protect it at all costs. The game is not over, Watson. It has only just begun." The morning unfolded with a grim urgency. Holmes sent word to Inspector Lestrade, arranging for the prisoner's transfer to Scotland Yard. He instructed Wiggins, now stable but weak, to remain under the doctor's care. The boy protested, but Holmes silenced him with a rare show of warmth. "You've done your part, Wiggins. Rest now, we'll need you yet." Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread his maps and notes across the table, piecing together the fragments of the conspiracy. The tall man's scar, the mention of Rotterdam, the prisoner's knowledge of his name all pointed to a network with deep roots. He recalled the coded message from the Crimson Jewel, its references to a crowned serpent and a throne of shadows. The phrases had seemed cryptic then, but now they took on a new weight. Was the tiara merely a symbol, a means to destabilize the monarchy, or was it a key to something greater? Watson watched as Holmes paced, his mind a whirlwind of deduction. "You're thinking it's more than a theft," Watson said, reading his friend's expression. Holmes nodded. "The tiara is a prize, but not the endgame. Our adversaries are playing for power, Watson power that spans continents. We must find the tall man before the transfer tomorrow night." The day passed in a blur of activity. Holmes dispatched his irregulars to scour the East End for any sign of the scarred man, while he and Watson revisited the palace to consult with the head of security. The vault's floor, discovered earlier, had been rectified, but Holmes insisted on additional measures, decoys, false routes, and a heavier guard. The head of security, a stern man named Captain Hargrove, bristled at Holmes' suggestions but relented under the weight of royal approval. As evening fell, a breakthrough came. One of the irregulars, a girl named Sally, reported a sighting of a man matching the tall man's description near a tavern in Whitechapel. He had been seen entering a back room with two others, their conversation hushed but urgent. Holmes and Watson set out at once, armed and ready for a confrontation. The tavern was a squalid den, its air thick with tobacco and cheap gin. Holmes, disguised as a dock worker, slipped inside, while Watson waited outside, ready to intercept anyone fleeing. The back room was guarded by a burly man, but Holmes dispatched him with a swift blow to the temple, dragging him into the shadows. Inside, the tall man stood over a table, studying a map with two companions. Their voices were low, but Holmes caught fragments. Southgate, midnight, Rotterdam. He signaled Watson through a cracked window, then stepped into the room, his revolver drawn. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice icy, "your plans have changed." The tall man spun, his pistol raised, but Holmes was faster. A single shot grazed the man's hand, sending his weapon skittering across the floor. The other two froze, their hands raised in surrender. Watson burst in, covering the group as Holmes advanced. "You've made a grave mistake," the tall man hissed, clutching his wounded hand. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Holmes smiled thinly. "On the contrary, I know precisely who I'm dealing with, and soon so will Scotland Yard." The men were bound and handed over to Lestrade's men, who arrived within the hour. The tall man's map revealed the final details of the Heist-planned ambush at the south gate, timed to coincide with the Tiara's transfer. Holmes' trap had failed to capture the mastermind, but it had disrupted the syndicate's plans, buying him precious time. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat by the fire, his pipe unlit. Watson, nursing a glass of brandy, watched him closely. "We stopped them tonight," Watson said, "but you're not satisfied." Holmes' eyes flickered with a rare trace of frustration. "We've clipped a branch, Watson, not the root. The mastermind remains at large, and the Tiara is still in danger. Tomorrow's gala will be their last chance. We must be ready." As the fire crackled, Holmes leaned back, his mind already racing toward the next move. The trap in the East End had been a partial success, but the game was far from won. The Queen's tiara, and perhaps the stability of the realm, hung in the balance.